Well, good morning. Welcome to those here in person as well as to those online to our third annual Sarcoidosis Conference. My name is Larry Franklin. I've had sarcoidosis for over 30 years and I'm a member of the Patient Advisory Board. I proudly stand here with Dr. Michelle Sharp, who is the co-director, along with Dr. Edward Chin of the Sarcoidosis Clinic here at Hopkins. What a blessing it is to have an organization such as Johns Hopkins and the Sarcoidosis Clinic to care about all of us, patients and care partners. So much so that this wonderful conference is being offered this year for the third year. You can expect great things today. Some of the best medical professionals are here to share information that will be encouraging as well as informative as we work together to manage this sometimes challenging disease. I offer a special thanks to Dr. Sharp and Dr. Chin for the work of their amazing staff and for all they do to help us, whether here in my chart or with the support group. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Sharp to share her welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to start by thanking the Johns Hopkins Sarcoidosis Patient Advisory Board, and especially Larry Franklin, who has truly been a champion behind this event. Everything you'll see and hear today exists because of their voices and their willingness to share their experiences to help others. Our hope for today is simple: that everyone in this room feels welcome, just as you are. Whether you're newly diagnosed, whether you're supporting someone you love, or years into your own journey. We hope that you leave with new knowledge and answers to questions you've been carrying. Thank you for trusting us with your time today, and let's get started.
All right, so we're going to jump right into our first talk of the day. So our first speaker is Dr. Kathy Bonham, who joins us again for the third year. Thank you so much for coming back. She is going to give us an overview of sarcoidosis. So Dr. Bonham is a pulmonary physician and the scientific director of the Sarcoidosis and Interstitial Lung Disease Center of Excellence at the University of Virginia. She is an expert in sarcoidosis patient care and researches the immune drivers of the disease. Dr. Bonham authored the 2020 guideline for sarcoidosis diagnosis and serves as the treasurer of ASOG. So I will hand it over to you, Dr. Bonham.
How's everybody doing out there? Hello? All set? Thank you for joining us on this rainy Baltimore morning. Hello to everybody who is also online. I'm so blessed to be able to join you today. This is such a wonderful event for patients, and I've just been so impressed by the offerings, the other speakers. I'm merely the person that will give you a little overview. Dr. Oji is coming on after me to talk a little bit about treatment. Thank you so much to the Johns Hopkins program for hosting this event, to Sean Holf, who is the Life and Breath Foundation leader, and to all of you who took some time out of your weekend day to be with us. I want to share a little bit of joy for you for coming here on Saturday to think about your health for sarcoidosis and my joy in being with you. I have no disclosures, and my presentation will go over a few main points. One is about the immune system and the relevance to sarcoidosis. I'll go over a little bit of the diagnosis of the disease, how we monitor after diagnosis, and I'll touch very briefly on treatment and leave the rest to Dr. Oji. All right. So to understand why we develop sarcoidosis, I think it's actually quite important to understand how our immune system is built. Our immune system is amazing. The things that our bodies can do to protect against threats like bacteria, fungus, virus, dirt, and foreign particles. There's different defenses that our body employs to try to approach these different problems that it encounters. And sarcoidosis as a disease is fundamentally a malfunction of one of these immune system defenses and is also fundamentally an overactivated immune system. I like to show this picture to kind of give you a sense of what things are like inside our bodies. These are photographs that have been generated to show you in the blue there, that's a big old T cell. It's one of the main white blood cells that sarcoidosis uses to generate the structures we call granulomas in sarcoidosis. There's a few antibodies floating in there, and there's a few orange cells there that are representative of a challenge to the immune system and how it fights. And I like to see these pictures because it reminds me kind of like maybe the Star Wars, it's really a battle in there with a lot of things flying around. And so I'll go over first one type of challenge your immune system sees. It's a bacteria or a virus, maybe something like a flu. And the goal of the immune system when it sees something like that is to essentially search and destroy that invader. And the weapon it has is using your B cells and your antibodies. Antibodies here are those little Y-shaped structures. They attach to the invader, the bacteria and virus. They tag it, and then they clear it. And when we speak about autoimmunity, that is a malfunction of this particular immune mechanism, where your body starts to recognize and generate antibodies against yourself. Examples of autoimmune diseases that sometimes will overlap with sarcoidosis are rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, autoimmune thyroiditis, or diseases like psoriasis. Also Sjogren's disease. Now, there's a second type of challenge that our immune system sees, and this is something like a slow-growing bacteria, a fungus, or sometimes a particle like a dust or sand, things like that. These are things like tuberculosis or silica. And the goal in this situation is not to search and destroy, but to search and surround that invader. These things are not something our immune system is very good at destroying, but it can try to wall it off. And there it's using these cells called T cells and macrophages. And when that goes wrong, we get something called granulomatous disease. And this is what sarcoidosis is. There are other diseases that mimic it. These are other diseases like hypersensitivity and pneumonitis, or something called silicosis, which results from silica exposure, like sand particles. And these are things that we look at when we're considering a diagnosis of sarcoidosis. You can see in this picture, this is a lab model. A researcher was generating to look at tuberculosis and also a model of sarcoidosis. And you can see what's happening there, that when the cells are seeing an invader, the immune cells try to surround it and encapsulate it. And that's kind of fundamentally what we're talking about in sarcoidosis. The cluster of cells that surround the invader is called a granuloma. And I likened this to like a pearl. So if you know how a pearl is made inside an oyster, it is trying to surround a little particle of sand to protect itself. And similarly, that is the mechanism our body is using when it's generating these clusters of cells that sarcoidosis patients have. If you've ever had a biopsy for your sarcoidosis and you read that report, it may talk about a granuloma. That's one of the key features that we're looking for on those biopsies. Here on your left hand of the screen, this is what a granuloma structure is in medical illustration. It's a cluster of immune cells. And there in the pink, you can see what it kind of looks like under the microscope. Okay, so key points on the immune system in sarcoidosis. So just remember, the immune system is a defensive weapon. It's trying to protect you from all the things that are out there in our world. And granulomas are that search and surround kind of defensive approach of the immune system. And when that goes wrong, we can get hit by friendly fire from our own immune system sometimes. Autoimmunity can happen, and granulomatous disease can happen. Many granulomatous diseases exist, but sarcoidosis is one of them. And sarcoidosis is fundamentally an overactive immune system. That's why many of our treatments seek to decrease the immune system. And malfunction of this granulomatous defensive approach is kind of fundamentally what we have in sarcoidosis. Okay. So super common question I get from my patients, why did my immune system develop this? What we know is that genes in the environment interact, genes that we inherit from mom and dad. And some patients, not all patients, can inherit genes that seem to make their immune system more likely to develop this disease. This is a big subject of research. There are some fantastic researchers now in our field that are looking at just this problem. There's a few at Hopkins. There's some who are at the Oklahoma Research Foundation. There's some in Europe now. We incompletely understand the genetics of sarcoidosis, and it's not truly used right now in clinics. We can't do genetic testing that tells you about your risk of sarcoidosis, except in very specific cases. We also understand that the environment is at play. And the reason we think that is because there are some types of sarcoidosis. Some sarcoidosis is more common in individuals with environmental exposures. So for example, firefighters have a lot more sarcoidosis than an average person. Individuals who served in the military have more sarcoidosis than the average person. People who were exposed to the dust from the World Trade Center 9/11 disaster have more sarcoidosis too. And so although the exact trigger is unknown, it's very likely that some environmental exposures activate the immune system and create this chronic disease. Another big question, why so many symptoms? In general, what I always like to point out is that our immune system is wonderful and that it must protect our whole body. The flip side of that is that a system that's built to defend the whole body can also make the whole body feel sick. And so while many patients have lung manifestations, it is actually quite frequent to have other manifestations outside the lungs, including the eyes, the heart, neurologic manifestations. Many of you, of course, have experienced these and are experts in your own disease. And sometimes those symptoms actually just extend to the whole body, of course. Whole body symptoms can be really difficult sometimes for patients to connect to an underlying unifying diagnosis. Sometimes it's not clear why you've been so fatigued. And I think that's a diagnosis journey that a lot of people have with symptoms of fatigue and pain and soreness that are maybe incompletely understood or not fully connected to sarcoidosis. But that is actually a very common experience. And one of the things that I think is a big gap in our research knowledge right now of how to treat these fatigue and pain and soreness symptoms. I will say we are in a better place in sarcoidosis than we were 10 years ago. One of those reasons I think is that the field has really organized a bit to generate some guidelines. They are not perfect, but they are a good starting point. In 2020, I was very honored to participate in one of the diagnostic guidelines. And the key points in making a diagnosis of sarcoidosis are that sarcoidosis is fundamentally a multi-system disease, meaning it occurs in different places in the body. And so when we make a diagnosis of sarcoidosis, we're looking for that. We're looking for, all right, if we got some lung involvement, is it also present in your lymph nodes? Do you have skin symptoms, perhaps some eye symptoms? And when those symptoms are present in more than one place, makes it much more likely that we have sarcoidosis and not a different diagnosis present. Another key feature of making a diagnosis is often a biopsy. Sometimes sarcoidosis symptoms can be so typical that a biopsy is not necessary. But in many cases, we have to consider whether or not there are other diseases that need to be reasonably excluded. And that's often why a diagnosis with a biopsy is recommended. We have very important things we have to exclude when we're making a diagnosis of sarcoidosis. Cancer, unfortunately, is a mimic. Infection is a great mimic. And so that's why we often do recommend biopsies. I will say that the diagnosis of sarcoidosis is not perfect. That is, our granulomas can be present in other diseases. I think that's why it's really important to go to an experienced sarcoidosis center, one like Johns Hopkins, where you have individuals who see sarcoidosis often and can give you that expert opinion. And one of the reasons that is because some of sarcoidosis is a little bit of pattern recognition. If you've ever watched this old medical show, Dr. House, he almost always considers sarcoidosis at some point. He finally does a sarcoidosis case. I think it's in the third season. And this is because, of course, there are some typical sarcoidosis cases, patterns like Lofgren syndrome. And sure enough, a lot of people do have lung symptoms and chest x-ray changes, but you can certainly have a lot of other things going on. So skin, rashes, tattoos that look funny. In cardiac sarcoidosis, of course, patients can develop heart blocks, which is EKG changes or rhythm problems, sometimes heart failure. And especially in young people, that's one case where I think we really have to look hard and make sure that we're looking at sarcoidosis as part of our thought process in cases of that. Other issues, again, issues that some of you likely have experienced: inflammatory eye disease, high calcium levels, getting kidney stones for no good reason, Bell's palsy. This would be a case of an erythema nodosum rash, which is part of that funny syndrome I mentioned called Lofgren's. This is actually found in a lot of people who have ancestry from Scandinavia. When I talk to my European colleagues, they say maybe up to a third of their patients experience this. And if that is the case for you, you get that rash on your legs, and you have some symptoms like fevers and ankle swelling, and your chest x-ray has swollen lymph nodes, you may just have Lofgren's, which is a type of acute or rapid onset sarcoidosis. The good news on that one is that type of sarcoidosis often is self-resolving, although not in every case. More often, especially in populations here in the US, the diagnosis of sarcoidosis is a little bit more like this. This would be an x-ray that I'd show a medical student and quiz them on. And, x-rays are really great at showing kind of bigger things, big lung nodules, fluid in the lungs. What this one shows actually is that the lungs look pretty good, but I'm going to throw a couple of purple circles here. That's the lymph nodes. These are the immune structures that are draining our lungs. And in this chest x-ray, they're bigger than they should be. And that's kind of typical for sarcoidosis patients. While I'm on the topic of chest x-rays, I always like to show patients this slide because one of the common questions I get is about the chest x-ray staging in sarcoidosis. So if you've already done a little background research on sarcoid, you'll often have heard about this scatting stage. And a lot of my patients ask me, what stage am I? So scatting was a doctor in England in the 1960s, and he published something in the British Medical Journal in 1961 that described sarcoidosis chest x-rays. And he lumped his patients, there were about 100 of them, into 4 different stages. And he sort of said, I think these are the categories maybe where stage 1 means they have big lymph nodes, and stage 2 means they have some changes in the lungs with the lymph nodes. Stage 3 means the lymph nodes are okay, but there's still some changes in the lungs. And then he made stage 4 scarring of the lungs or fibrosis. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so our field, for better or for worse, still sometimes refers to this staging system. You might read it in your reports or sometimes in your clinic notes. I think the problem with it is that we now have other staging systems, particularly in lungs, like for lung cancer, where there's also a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 is the worst. And for sarcoidosis, the truth is that it's not quite that easy. Some patients are stage 1 or 2, but lots of symptoms, and they warrant treatment. Some patients have some scarring of the lungs and therefore are stage 4, but don't have many symptoms and haven't progressed or had a lot of trouble in many years. And they might not need treatment. They might have quiet disease at that point. So while this is kind of a descriptive staging system, if you have a certain number attached to your chest x-ray for your scatting stage, I would just talk about it with your sarcoidosis provider about what that really means for you. And maybe if you are in sort of that 3, 4 category, that might not be a cause for panic. I also like to point out the skin findings for sarcoidosis. Again, many of you may experience, if you have old scars sometimes or tattoos, that they can change when your sarcoidosis becomes active. When I have a patient who's new to the clinic and we're trying to get a diagnosis for them, I always ask them about their tattoos and ask if I can look at them or feel them with my hand. The fact is that sarcoidosis is a disease where the cells that are making the granulomas are attracted to foreign pigment in the skin. And so when your sarcoidosis is active, those cells will go there and sometimes can create a lot of inflammation around the tattoo pigment, or sometimes in an old scar too. And this is an example of kind of a typical look. It's sometimes a little bit like little bumps under the skin. They can be red. Sometimes they itch. Oftentimes they don't. Here's another example of a typical sarcoidosis looking tattoo for me. This was a patient that I was evaluating as a possible new diagnosis. He had some other features like some inflammatory eye disease and some nodules on his scans. And he was sent to me because everyone said, well, he's going to need a lung biopsy to know what's really going on. And I looked at that tattoo and I said, wow, that looks pretty typical. I think you probably have sarcoidosis. And so I sent him to our friendly skin doctors, the dermatologists. They're always so perky, our dermatologists, colleagues. I like them a lot. And they sent me this message. They said, the pathology, that means the microscope, looks perfect for sarcoid. And so he got a little biopsy of one of these spots in his skin. I didn't have to send him to a lung biopsy, and we made his diagnosis and got him on treatment. Of course, after you get a diagnosis of sarcoidosis, doesn't stop there. We have to look carefully to make sure and do a nice survey of your body and make sure that we don't have active disease in other places. That is important. Our screening at diagnosis is balanced by the risk of doing the screening, of course, and doing a lot of testing. Right now, what's recommended is that patients get an EKG. So putting those, looking at your heart rhythm. If there's any concern for that or symptoms that could be cardiac, often the protocol is to proceed to doing an echocardiogram, sometimes a heart monitor that lasts a few days looking for rhythm problems. And then there's advanced cardiac imaging like cardiac MRI and PET. And certainly anybody who's having cardiac symptoms like palpitations, meaning your heart is skipping beats, or if you're having fainting spells or dizzy spells, usually we do the whole workup looking for inflammation in your heart. It's just that important to detect that. Everyone with a diagnosis of sarcoidosis should see a great eye doctor, get that screening, looking for the inflammation in the back of your eye. I also assess carefully for things like sleep apnea, depression, quality of life, lung function testing, and of course, x-rays. And then yearly, we check your labs. We make sure that your kidney function's okay. How's your liver doing? Is your blood count all right? And asking about symptoms too. Oh, got a little frozen. Oh. Computer wants to do an update. There we go, treatment. I'm not going to step on Dr. Oji's toes here, but I will merely tell you in one slide. Many patients with sarcoidosis go onto steroids like prednisone. Steroids can be useful in the sense that if you have a lot of symptoms or very severe sarcoidosis like neurosarcoidosis, we still reach for them. But the field is moving away from steroids because we recognize the side effects are not worth it. And I have wonderful colleagues now who have even done some amazing clinical trials looking at a no steroids approach, even from the beginning. And certainly in mild to moderate lung pulmonary sarcoidosis, that has now become a standard that you can go without steroids. You can start something like methotrexate and your outcomes will be just as good and save you the steroids. I also tell my patients, consider physical training and exercise. It is great for your body. It is great for your brain and your mental health. When that's been formally tested, patients can make big improvements, 10% improvement in their ability to walk after only 12 weeks. There's going to be some great speakers later on our wellness and nutrition and mental health. Don't forget that piece. I think that's almost as important as your medication, if not more. And of course, developing a great relationship with your team. So key points, kind of talked a little fast. but I'm happy to take plenty of questions and even get us a little ahead. So sarcoidosis is an immune disease. It is a situation where our immune system has become overactive, dysfunctional. And when we do biopsies, perhaps to make the diagnosis of sarcoidosis that's active in different parts of our body, the key findings that we are looking for are structures of immune cells that are called granulomas. And your granuloma biopsies should have all of the studies on them to make sure that they're not granulomas from something else. So checking for infection, checking for abnormal cells there that could be associated with cancer. When we don't find a trigger, but there are typical looking granulomas for sarcoidosis, then we're much more sure of the disease. It can affect different organs. This is why screening is so important at the diagnosis, and following with your team is so important. And sometimes the symptoms that we have, like fatigue, these whole body immune system symptoms, you're not crazy. That's your sarcoidosis. And you can have good days and bad days, and that is you. And I think that things like exercise and nutrition help. Sometimes just being aware of your own body and giving yourself a break when you're having a bad day is okay. Diagnosis is made by recognizing key features like having more than one part of the body that's affected, often a biopsy in most cases, and ruling out other diseases. I mentioned screening for eyes. Don't forget to see your eye doctor. Don't forget to get screening for your cardiac involvement, and talk to your physicians and providers about your treatment plan. And thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Care physician and associate professor of medicine at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. She is the director of the Sarcoidosis Center of Excellence at ECU, which she helped establish, and is nationally and internationally recognized as a leading expert in the care and management of patients with pulmonary and extrapulmonary sarcoidosis. So thank you, Dr. Obi, for coming back again this year and joining us to give your talk on emerging treatments. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me back this year. I thank you all for the honor of being able to participate. I thank Dr. Michelle Sharp and the entire team for inviting me. Thank you all. It's my honor and my pleasure to be here with you all. All right, so I'm going to be talking to us today about current and emerging treatment in sarcoidosis. Dr. Bonham has set me up very nicely. If I can get my slide. These are my disclosures. None of these disclosures have any impact or bearing on my lecture today. So Dr. Bonham already gave an excellent overview of sarcoidosis. Mine is just 2 or 3 slides long. I'm going to talk to us about indications for treatment in sarcoidosis, talk about current treatment options. We'll spend some time discussing emergent treatment options, and then I'm hoping to have some good time for questions. And so, like Dr. Bonham mentioned, sarcoidosis is a chronic granulomatous inflammatory disease. It's characterized by the presence of non-caseating granulomas, essentially your body's microphone. Hello, can you all hear me? Okay. So essentially, I'm trying to figure out which microphone works better, but we'll see. So essentially, your body system kind of goes into a hyperdrive and forms these clumps or clusters of immune cells known as granulomas that can really deposit in any part of your body, and in most people affects the lungs. This is what the sarcoid granuloma looks like. You can kind of see those T cells on the periphery that Dr. Bonham talked about, and you can see that in the center of the granuloma is your macrophages, or those first-line defenses of your body. Now, the good news, there is some good news about sarcoidosis, is that about 50% of patients will resolve their disease, usually within the first 3 years. But about a third of patients will develop chronic, progressive, debilitating disease, causing death in about 5% of patients. We don't know what causes sarcoidosis. We think it has to do with a gene and environment interaction. Dr. Bonham already mentioned that. But guys, we do know that sarcoidosis is a mean disease, and it's real. It's real for everyone here. It's real for those people online. It affects every system in the body. I'm sure if you look on this photograph, you can see parts and parcels of yourself. No system or part of the body is excluded. Sarcoidosis has a huge impact on the daily lives of patients and their families. And so this is a study from the Netherlands in which they asked patients, what is the influence of sarcoidosis on your life at this moment? And they also asked the providers, their caregivers, what is the influence of having a partner with sarcoidosis at this point in time? And about 75%, 3/4 of patients and partners that were surveyed reported that sarcoidosis had significant impact on their daily lives. Now, sarcoidosis is associated with increased mortality. In this study right here, you see that patients who have sarcoidosis have a 62% higher rate of mortality than the general population, and they are dying about 2 years earlier. For patients who have severe disease, mortality rate is about twofold that of the general population. Sarcoidosis is associated with a decreased quality of life and significant angst. About 80% of patients with sarcoidosis report that they are worried about their disease. They are worried about the trajectory of their disease. Sarcoidosis hits the pocket, and it hits the pocket bad. And so in this study right here, this is an economic study from a database looking at about maybe 7,000 patients, comparing it to, with sarcoidosis, comparing it to other patients in the database. They found that sarcoidosis patients had about 40% more inpatient admits, 15% more likely to be in the emergency room, and the cost of sarcoidosis was higher compared to the rest of the population in that database. And when they looked at it together, caring for patients with sarcoidosis cost anywhere from about $2 to $8 billion. It impacts individuals. And in this study right here, you see that for the first year of diagnosis, sarcoidosis patients earned about 8% less, and they had about 26 more work loss days than others. And I think if you're here in the, well, you are here in the room and you have sarcoidosis, I think you can relate with all these numbers. And so in the spirit of empowerment, I think that it's important that we understand this disease, we understand this disease better, and we understand how to treat the disease and what available options we have for treating sarcoidosis. And so really the first thing to talk about is the when and the why we treat sarcoidosis, what we refer to as the indications for treatment. And the first thing I want to say that not every patient who has sarcoidosis needs treatment. If you remember from my first slide, we talked about half of patients will have spontaneous disease resolution. And so according to the most recent treatment guidelines, there are two major reasons for treating patients with sarcoidosis. The first is to improve quality of life. And so when patients have such significant symptom burden, whether it's cough, it's shortness of breath, severe fatigue, being in pain, such that it's impairing and impacting their quality of life, they can function like they need to. That's an indication to treat. And of course, being sure that it's sarcoidosis that's causing those symptoms. The second reason we treat sarcoidosis is to avoid danger of organ failure or dysfunction and to minimize the risk of mortality. And so that speaks to severity of disease. And so when you translate this, we want to treat patients who have severe disease, who have significant risk of death from their disease. And that refers to patients who have advanced lung disease, where they have scarring in their lungs, or where they have high pressure in their lungs, what we call pulmonary hypertension. Those manifestations of disease are associated with significant mortality or death from disease, and so we want to treat those patients. Patients who have sarcoidosis in their heart or in their brain, those are severe manifestations of disease that we want to treat. Patients who have sarcoidosis in their eye or in their kidney have associated morbidity, meaning they can lose vision, they can go on dialysis with progressive renal dysfunction. We want to treat those patients. For patients who have sarcoidosis in their lungs with evidence of lung function decline, we want to treat those patients. And patients who have more severe forms of disease, like multi-organ disease, we want to treat those patients. When we do treat patients, we always want to weigh the risk of side effects and medication toxicity. We also want to weigh the fact that some medicines we use can also impair quality of life, and I'll come to that. Some of these medicines are associated with new comorbidities, increased risk of infection. And at all times, when we make a decision to treat, especially for those patients who have lung disease, we want to weigh the risk of the disease resolving on its own or the disease or the disease progressing. And so that comes to the scarring stage that Dr. Bonham mentioned. And so, like she mentioned, patients who have sarcoidosis just in their lymph nodes, about 60 to 90% of those patients will resolve their disease on its own. So if you have sarcoidosis in your lungs, and it's only in your lungs, and it's just affecting the lymph nodes, what we call scarring stage 1, sometimes, a lot of times actually, it's okay to hold off on treatment. Now, of course, if in addition to the lung, you have it in the heart or the brain, that does take precedence. And so scarring stages go all the way to 4, like Dr. Bonham mentioned. Patients in scarring stage 3 or 4 are less likely to resolve their disease. Their lung disease is more likely, in a lot of cases, to progress and to affect lung function. And so those patients we would consider treatment for. When we do treat patients, we have several treatment options. Traditionally, we've grouped these into what we call first-line treatment, which is prednisone. And you see that thumb sign down there, and there's a reason for that. I think one of the patients asked a question about or raised the importance of how steroids affected them negatively. We'll talk about that. We have a second-line treatment or antimetabolites. We have the third-line treatment or biologics, and then we have a fourth-line treatment where we really don't have much data. All right, let's talk about steroids, because I have a personal war, a personal crusade about steroids, and I'd like to present that crusade and that war to us here. So first things first, steroids do work, and they do work very fast, but it comes at a huge cost. And so up here is one of the earliest studies looking at prednisone in patients with sarcoidosis. And you can see where they looked at about 170 patients with sarcoidosis. They gave some of them steroids and others they didn't. And they found that after 5 years, patients who got steroids for their sarcoidosis were more likely to have improved lung function and less likely to have abnormal chest X-rays at the end of 5 years. And so steroids do work. But guys, it comes at a cost. And so just a show of hands, if this picture up here looks like you or like anyone you know after they started steroids for their sarcoidosis. Yeah, I see those hands. I see those hands. I see those hands. And so that's why I'm about to wage for the next 3 or 4 slides this war on steroids. And so steroids are associated with significant toxicity. So in this study from the Cleveland Clinic, they found that sarcoidosis patients who got steroids for their disease were about 2-fold more likely to have a new comorbidity, whether it's hypertension, whether it's diabetes, or to have obesity after being treated for sarcoidosis. In this other study, we see here that the side effect or the toxicity of steroids remains. And so comparing patients who never got steroid versus ever got steroid, whether it was past steroid use or current steroid use, we see that they have residual side effects. In this nice study here, we see that patients in a clinic who got not a lot of steroids, just about 500 milligrams of steroids in the previous year, were more likely to report reduced quality of life and increased fatigue. And in this nice study here, something that we don't pay much attention to, we see that sarcoidosis patients are actually more likely to end up hospitalized with severe infections when you compare to controls, and that risk is being driven by increased use of steroids in sarcoidosis. And so steroids are bad. And one more thing, by the way, there is really no good steroid dose. And in this study here from Dr. Doria in India, you see that patients who got 40 milligrams a day of prednisone or 20 milligrams per day of prednisone, what we call low-dose steroids, at the end of 6 months, they had the same toxicity, and the higher dose of steroid really didn't have any benefit at all. And so I think it's definitely time, kind of like was said in the audience, to move away from steroids. And here we go. But don't, it's not just me. I think the field itself is also moving away from steroids. And so this is a paper that was just published in the Lancet Journal in April of this year, where WASOG, which is the World Association of Sarcoidosis and Other Granulomatous Diseases, in combination with ASOG, which is the America's equivalent association, mentioned very nicely that oral corticosteroids should no longer actually be considered first-line therapy in all sarcoidosis patients. And then in certain situations like very severe forms of disease, including cardiac and neurological manifestations, where use of steroids as initial treatment is indicated, the goal at all times should be to get patients off steroids. And so the take-home point for prednisone use in sarcoidosis is use steroids only if necessary. You want to wean prednisone as quickly and as safely, I should say, as possible. We can start weaning prednisone as early as 2 to 4 weeks. Higher doses of steroids have not been associated with faster or better improvement in lung function. And we want to start steroid-sparing therapy early. And so what are these steroid-sparing therapies? Now, we used to call them second line. In my practice, actually, I've stopped calling them second line therapy because second line means you kind of have to use steroids first. I now call them steroid-sparing therapy because there's actually data, very good solid data, especially in pulmonary sarcoidosis, that they do just as well when we use them upfront. And so this second line, or better terminology, steroid-sparing therapies include methotrexate, azathioprine, leflunomide, and Cellcept. And the most commonly used of these is methotrexate. That's actually the one that has the most data in support of its use. And so methotrexate was originally designed as an anti-cancer drug, but we use it in much lower doses for its anti-inflammatory property. It can be given by mouth or it can be given as an injection. It sometimes is a little bit slow to act, but it does the work and it does it well. And so in this study right here that was published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Kalman's group looked at patients who were randomized to receive prednisone upfront versus methotrexate upfront. And they found out that if you follow the blue line, patients who got prednisone, on the bottom right here, the x-axis is the week, which means kind of like the time after they started the treatment. And this right here is looking at improvement in their lung function. And you see that patients who got prednisone, they had a very rapid increase or improvement in their lung function. So we're not arguing at all that steroids work. We know they work and it works fast. Patients who got methotrexate kind of like, improved a little bit slowly. But at the end of 6 months, right here, 24 weeks, you see that the improvement in lung function is about the same. this really wasn't any different at all statistically. Importantly, patients with sarcoidosis have said time and time and time again that the most important thing to them is improvement in quality of life. And so when this same study looked at quality of life, you see that patients who got prednisone, they got better fast. Their quality of life improved fast, but you can see it started declining very quickly. The side effects and the toxicity build up. And then methotrexate improved quality of life and steadily improved quality of life. In the most recent analysis that they talked about actually in this year's WASOG, both the lung function in methotrexate as well as the quality of life in methotrexate beyond the 6-month mark continue to improve. And so methotrexate actually has now become a favored first-line therapy in sarcoidosis. Of course, every medicine does have side effects. And I really wish I could say methotrexate doesn't have side effects. It does have its own side effects. So in this study, you see that about 96% of patients in both prednisone and methotrexate had side effects, but the side effects in patients who got methotrexate were more likely have resolved by the end of the study, whereas the side effects from prednisone were continued. And in this other study right here, patients who got methotrexate were looked at for up to 6 months, 6 years, I should say, after receiving methotrexate, and most of them were doing well, tolerating the methotrexate very well. Now, the other second-line therapy that we use in sarcoidosis is called Imiran or azathioprine. It's very similar in terms of steroid-sparing efficacy to methotrexate. It was also originally developed as a cancer drug. In this study right here, it worked just as well as methotrexate. It has a slightly different side effect profile. It has a slightly increased risk of infection. Patients actually tolerated methotrexate better. For women of childbearing age, methotrexate can harm unborn babies, whereas azathioprine is safe, so it's a viable option in that group of patients. And then the other second-line drugs that we use, not very much data in support of these, but the available options and steroid-sparing alternatives to prednisone include leflunomide, mycophenolate, and then hydroxychloroquine is much weaker, and we typically use it for patients who have skin sarcoid. Both these medicines here kind of block the T cells and dampen the immune system like Dr. Bonham talked to us about. All right, moving on to third-line medicines, or what we call biologics. The biologics that have been most commonly used and studied in patients with sarcoidosis include infliximab and adalimumab. And both of them are TNF-alpha blockers. TNF-alpha is kind of like the main cytokine or the main molecule that drives increased granuloma in patients with sarcoidosis. And so infliximab has been most widely studied. In this study right here, we saw that patients who got infliximab had improvement in their lung function. It's given as an IV, typically every 4 to 6 weeks, and it can be given either at an infusion center or at home. It does have an increased risk of infection and reactivation of TB, so we always check patients to make sure they don't have TB before we give them infliximab. Infliximab has shown efficacy in all forms of sarcoidosis, including severe disease manifestations, sarcoidosis involving the heart, sarcoidosis involving the brain, sarcoidosis involving the eye, and in severe skin manifestations, it's been shown to be very efficacious in these patients. Adalimumab is the other biologic agent that we use. Unlike infliximab, which is given as an IV, adalimumab is given as a subcute injection, so it's, patients have slightly more independence with adalimumab, but technique for injection matters. And so we give adalimumab either once a week or once every other week. Now, not all TNF blockers, which is what infliximab and Humira are created equal. There's actually some that may worsen sarcoidosis. And so Humira and infliximab are the ones that have shown benefit in sarcoidosis. They're both very expensive. There's really no FDA approval, and so oftentimes they are used as off-label drugs, which means that they can be hard and challenging to get. All right, so with that, I'm going to move on to emerging therapies for sarcoidosis. I'm going to talk about the three most forefront with respect to research in sarcoidosis. And last year, oh, well, I have this graph here. Okay, let's see. I'm just going to summarize this right here. This is the body's first line, what Dr. Bonham talked about. These are your macrophages that kind of search and destroy infections. Yeah. And this right here is what we're calling the sarcoid antigen, which we really don't know. This antigen interacts with this macrophage and, activates it and causes more increased reactions, forming granulomas. And then when you have several of these cytokines or inflammatory substances in the system, they cause persistence of the granuloma or can cause the disease to progress into scarring and fibrosis. Now, I included this here because the drugs that I'm going to talk about actually have effects on various stages right here. And so the first one is efzofitimod, which is a biologic agent that binds what we call neuropilin-2. Big fancy word for they're located on the wall of that first step, the macrophages. And when I presented last year, at that time we had data on a phase 2 study which showed that efzofitimod was, very promising in sarcoidosis. About 37 patients who had received efzofitimod versus placebo, it showed improvement in their lung function, in their quality of life, and we were extremely hopeful that the phase 3 studies would be beneficial. But we got results from the phase 3 study last year, and unfortunately, efzofitimod didn't meet its primary endpoint. You can see that the lines representing efzofitimod and placebo are completely indistinguishable in terms of decreasing prednisone use or improving lung function. It did, however, improve quality of life. Unfortunately, the study wasn't designed solely to determine improvement in quality of life. And so I think the company is still working to see if there's any forms or applications of efzofitimod in sarcoidosis that can be salvaged. The second drug that is being looked at is XTMAB16. XTMAB16 is an anti-TNF agent. Again, the TNF alpha is the primary molecule that is responsible for driving and increasing granuloma size and persistent in sarcoidosis. It's kind of like infliximab and adalimumab, but unlike both of them, these arms here that are active is made from Chinese hamster ovaries, and it's supposed to make XTMAB less immunogenic so that your body can tolerate it better. And it's been shown in preclinical studies to actually inhibit granuloma formation. Now, the phase 2 study, again, very small study, was just concluded early this year, and it showed very promising results. And we're excited. They're planning larger phase, either phase 2B or phase 3 trials. So we're hopeful that we can design the studies well and that XTMAB16 will be useful in patients with sarcoidosis. Now, Janus kinase inhibitors or JAK inhibitors are also being studied in sarcoidosis. If you remember that original slide I showed you, you can see where JAK inhibitors or the Janus kinase pathway has been implicated in progressive sarcoidosis and sarcoidosis being fibrotic. And JAK inhibitors actually have been shown in some observational studies, especially in patients with skin sarcoidosis, to result in clearing of skin lesions with sustained improvement. And there was a study of JAK inhibitors in skin sarcoidosis that was concluded and showed very promising results, and they started their phase 3 trials with the first patient enrolled on the 1st of August of this year. Finally, mTOR inhibitors have also shown promise in patients with sarcoidosis. This is a mouse model where mice, I should say, genetically modified mice who had their mTOR pathway. mTOR stands for the mammalian target of rapamycin. Where they had their mTOR pathway unbridled, those mice developed granulomas that were large and were sustained. And in this study right here, again, very small phase 2 trial, we see that patients with skin sarcoid who got mTOR inhibitors had clearing of their skin lesions. And actually, unlike a lot of the medicines we use, the cleared skin persisted, or the results from the trial persisted up to a year after. And so that's, again, very promising. And so putting it all together, drug treatment in sarcoidosis. And so the first thing is you want to evaluate for symptoms. So you want to evaluate for symptoms, and you want to see, does the patient need to be treated? If the patient doesn't have symptoms, doesn't have severe disease, or doesn't meet criteria otherwise for treatment, it's actually okay to observe the patient. Now, if you have mild to moderate symptoms, but you don't have evidence of severe organ involvement, there has to be a conversation as to prednisone versus steroid-sparing therapy. And in patients with lung sarcoidosis, there's solid evidence that using steroid-sparing therapy upfront is as good as using prednisone with less toxicity. And so that is, a path to follow. And then for patients who have severe disease or organ or life-threatening disease, where we have to initiate prednisone, the recommendation is to consider upfront initiation of prednisone as well as steroid-sparing therapy, with the plan to rapidly discontinue prednisone over 3 to 6 months. And so to summarize, not every patient with sarcoidosis needs treatment. Up to 50% of patients will go into remission on their own. Now, treatment is indicated to improve quality of life and to avoid danger of organ failure or death. When treatment is indicated, a stepwise approach is advocated. Now, steroids are associated with a lot of toxicity and side effects, and the goal is to minimize steroid use at all times. The future is bright with novel therapies for sarcoidosis. And with that, I would say thank you very, very much.
Up next, we have Sean Hull with the Life and Breath Foundation. And just a heads up, as Sean is coming up here, we will be heading to lunch after this next speaker. We have a number of display tables out. We have a ton of games and different activities during the lunch hour. So I'll be talking a little more about that. But one of our nonprofit sponsors who has been with us since we started this program is Life and Breath Foundation. So Life and Breath is a local sarcoidosis foundation that has a goal to increase awareness of sarcoidosis, as well as provide resources for patients and families. So Sean, thank you once again for being here with us today. We are getting your slide deck loaded. Perfect. Hand this off to you.
Thank you. Good morning. How's everybody? It's really nice to see some of you again from last year. I recognize some faces and everything, and I'm just happy to be here. Love the story. Love the story. And, it's already been said, but the more that we can share amongst ourselves, the better off we're all going to be as a community. And that was really important to me. I guess while we're getting the slides put together, I lost my mother at age 59 in 1996 with sarcoidosis. And we didn't know she had it. So she was struggling by herself. I'm not even sure about the conversations that she was having with her medical professional. But I'm just thinking about today, what you have, as hard as it is to navigate each and every day. It's just important that things have gotten much better. And the education, the communication, and the understanding that you are not by yourself, even though any and everybody that you talk to doesn't see it, doesn't understand it, and can't feel it. That's why it's important for us to stay together, to communicate, and allow others to kind of benefit from our experiences. And so I can keep going.
Sorry, we're coming.
I just wanted to bring some energy into it. You know what I mean? Just do something with it. I had a loss and I'm trying to do something with it. So the Life and Breath Foundation, this is our 28th year of providing support for you. So I went through a journey about, losing your mother. You only have one. She taught me so much. She was there for me. What can I do in her memory? So Life and Breath Foundation is my birthday present to her and my Mother's Day present to her each and every day. And so each and every year that has passed, what I've been able to find out is I'm looking for ways that I can help. I'm looking for ways that I want to find a cure for this. I really do. I want to find a cure. So then how do I do that? How do I find the patients that I can go help? Because I can't find them. So my journey was, let me put the flag in the ground and hoist it as high as possible and allow people to see Life and Breath Foundation. And so what I would love for you to take away from today is to understand that we are in it to educate. We are in it to build resources, educational resources that are going to be able to help you with this navigation that has to happen each and every day. And so I'm thinking about all the wonderful things the doctor said this morning about what is it, what do you have to do to understand it, and what steps that you can take to be successful. And then it's a mean disease, right? It's a complicated disease. It's an expensive disease. It's a disease that kind of prevents you sometimes from taking that necessary step. So what is it that we can do? I have all the energy in the world and the inspiration, but what I didn't know is what I need to know about the medical field and what I need to know about what your journey's about. So I created not only a board of directors, but a medical advisory committee, and they helped me create really what I want to get to today, if this would ever come up, but it's not. But it's okay. I'm going to get right to the chase, and I may have to backtrack a little bit, but we created a healthcare tracker for you to be able to use in your journey. So if you could think about the first 3 years that are very impactful about what is it, what are the terms? I mean, there was a lot of terms that were shared up there. There was a lot of information shared with the medications and the effects and level 1, 2, and 3. So where do you put all that information? Where are you putting it right now? So through my experience, it was the Manila folder, it was the Excel spreadsheet, it was the Word document, and it was a whole bunch of pages that were in a shoebox. So what my thought was is that could I create a tracker system that would be able to help you put things in one spot? So educational resources, glossary of terms, questions that you seem to ask, but then you forget the answer. And then it'd be great to go to one spot to be able to get to that. And all the while, you could then track not only your appointments and your meetings and your tests, but you could track also how you're feeling, other medications that you're taking, your sleep patterns, what you felt like, what you ate, nutrition. All those wonderful things now could be in one spot. And what can you do with that? You could be your own best self-advocate as you communicate with your physician. And so that's what we thought was a good idea. I have some stats to be able to show you. I shared this a little bit last year, and maybe it's been out there for 2.5 years. We've been getting feedback from you guys. You guys telling us, is it helpful? What should I add? What should I take away? What didn't I think about? So we're all things that we took in consideration.
Cue me whenever you're ready for next
All right.
up.
Do I need to, or you're going to do it for me?
Do it for you.
Okay. So mission, just to make sure everybody understands what we're after and what we're trying to do. This is our sarcoidosis community, right? We have people online, we have people in person, but it's really just to effectively bring tools together that'll help you kind of not only decipher and understand, but to maximize your quality of life, give you that environment where we can share amongst each other, and then build more awareness with with our medical community, especially as things start to change. We can switch. Here's the board that I put together, just people that I have touched through my life and that wanted to help. And so I stay out of trouble. And Dr. Sharp's not on here, but she's on there. Dr. Moeller is on there. Dr. Chin is on there in spirit. Okay, next one. All right, next one. So what do we do? So the first thing that we did, again, this was coming out of COVID. If you could think March 2020, everybody's stuck in your house. And then, well, what's going on with this COVID thing? Well, it seems to be something that affects the lungs and everything. And especially our patients have a high degree of instance where that in effect happens with them. So what I thought is that why not put together a monthly engagement of medical professionals for you to be able to be educated, ask your question, and go one-on-one with this medical professional. I have a lot of questions, so I want to go one-on-one with them. And then what I realized is that there's a lot of other people around the country that had the same question that I had. And so, wow, now I understand that I'm not by myself. So we started this in April of 2020, and it's been going strong. And so we've been able to expand our community of people around the country. And what they were able to say is that, you know what, Sean, you guys are spoiled in the Washington, D.C. area, because you got all these wonderful hospitals, you got all these research areas and everything, and we get to benefit from that. And think about the cities that are within 3 hours away, within 5 hours away. But what about the individual that's in Durango, Colorado, 5 hours away from Denver, that has the same challenges that you have? What are we going to do with them? So this has provided us an opportunity to be able to do that, to be able to reach that person and to be able to communicate and provide a bridge to experts in the field that can detail with their professional on what the next step possibly should be. Next slide. We also created a support group. It looks the same as the one with Johns Hopkins. And this is just something that our patients ask for. It's just additional time to be able to share. So you can think about what's being done today, sharing in this environment, but if we can do that on a monthly basis, as things come up, you can get more information that you can utilize for the rest of that year. Next. So this is the tracker that I was talking about. So we've put out 850 of those in a digital sense. We print and sent out 600 of those. So total patients reached 1,200. It's free. You just email me. And then whatever way that you would like to engage it, whether it's printed or digital, we're going to do that. But it just allows you to go through those necessary steps that you go through in your journey, and really gives you an opportunity to detail it and put it away. So the countries I'm most impressed by, the people that are touching us outside the United States. So we have a lot of friends outside the community here in the United States that we are helping also. Next slide. These are all in the area of what does the Life and Breath does? What do they do? How do they help? One of the other areas is naturally we have events. And this event that I created was more trying to create an environment that promoted healthy lifestyles, healthy eating, nutrition. You can include your family. come on out for a 5K, come on out for a 1K walk. Can't bring your dog, but you can bring everybody else. And this year I had it at the Canton waterfront, right in downtown Baltimore. We ran along the water, and it really gave another opportunity for us to get out, to do something positive with a healthy lifestyle in mind. So we really loved that. Sarcoidosis was influential in joining us in our partnership in doing this. So big thank you to them. Next slide. One of the things that we've done, and this is, if we've been in business 28 years, I've held a golf tournament the first 10, and then the financial crisis got in my way. Then I went and had another event. So I'm bringing the golf tournament back. It's September the 28th. If you use this QR code, you can find out more information about the golf tournament if you want to participate, or if you want to get connected to us in our website, you can use that QR code and find out some of the other areas and ways that we can help. It's a fun event. We have some of our former Baltimore Orioles and Baltimore Ravens players come out, some players from the NBA, former players from the NBA, ESPN, CBS Sports are all going to be there to join us. Next slide. As far as our reach to folks out there, social media has really become a way that we're connecting with folks, as I mentioned earlier, but just sharing some statistics, from our YouTube page. So those speaker series engagements that I talked about, whether it's nutrition, whether it's the mental awareness, whether it's about the different drugs that are out there, all of that is stored on my YouTube library. You can log in, it's free. You can go in there, and then if you don't have the ability to take notes today, there's a lot of great information in the library that you can use, but we have almost 24 subscribers on our Facebook and Instagram. We have 9,000 followers, and our email list continues to build at 3,200 subscribers. Next. Really happy with the partnership with Sarcoidosis. It is everything in my mission to be able to partner, to be able to better educate the patients that we serve. So as the foundation, we're trying to build the bridge between you and the medical professionals. So however we can do that, we want to do that and be that base that makes it easier. But it's been something that's been really good. Want to definitely commend Dr. Sharp. I went out to the World Association of Sarcoidosis and other granulomas, something else. Right. I went out there. I went out to Porto, Portugal, to meet some of the other individuals around the world that are doing wonderful things, just to let them know a little bit about us, but more importantly for me to learn a little bit more about what they're doing, how they're changing the scope. And we found out that we are making progress and everything. I'm just happy to be a part of it. Next slide. Big thank you. This is the best day that I have all year, to be able to see you and stand before you and help you understand that I'm there to help, and trying to stay on time because I am in between you and lunch. A big thank you, and I appreciate it. If I can help, please let me know.
We're going to get back into our afternoon session. I hope you all had a wonderful lunch. I heard a lot of clapping and noise from the bingo room, so I know a lot of extra raffle tickets were won. Up next, we have Dr. Jana Ponce, who is here to talk about nutrition and lung disease implications for sarcoidosis care. And I already know this is going to be a hot topic based on the questions we've had thus far. So Dr. Ponce, I'm going to have you come up as we have your slides loaded. So Dr. Ponce is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and director of the Doctor of Nutrition and Dietetics program. As a registered dietitian nutritionist with a clinical background, her research focuses on the role of nutrition in resolving inflammation to prevent and treat disease. In addition to her academic role, Dr. Ponce serves as clinical nutrition coordinator at Nebraska Medicine, where she leads data-driven initiatives, analytics, and research to advance quality improvements in clinical nutrition. So with that, Dr. Ponce, hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be here and to talk a little bit about nutrition with you. Like was just mentioned, my name is Jana Ponce. I come from the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and I'm a registered dietitian, but I'm also a nutrition scientist. So I'm really excited to share some information with you. Is it not coming? There we go. All right. Okay, so before we get started, I do have a question for everybody, and that includes for everybody here in person and online. I'm not exactly sure what the functionality online looks like, so if you can either give a reaction like a thumbs up or put something in the chat. In the audience here, if you could raise your hand, I just want to know how many of you have thought about how your nutrition or what you eat can impact your sarcoidosis. Okay, that is a large majority of the in-person audience. That's fantastic. So whether you have thought about this a lot or if you have never thought about it before, what my goal today is to give you some information about why nutrition matters and to give you some tangible takeaways that you can implement at home but are backed by research and science. To do that, I'm going to introduce you to 3 patients today. Those patients are Maya, Ron, and Elise, and each one of them is going to bring us a different nutrition issue. So first, let's meet Maya. Maya is a 48-year-old female, and she lives at home with her 2 teenage sons. As anyone knows that who has been in this stage of life, food is whatever comes quickly. So think convenience foods, packaged foods, fast food, etc. She was recently diagnosed with sarcoidosis, and like many do when you're diagnosed with a new disease, she started reading online. She saw that inflammation was a huge part of sarcoidosis, and that immediately led to a question. What can I eat to help with my inflammation? When we think about nutrition and inflammation, it's really easy to want to reach for one superfood that will magically stop inflammation in its tracks. Instead, I want to introduce you to a food category that has really interesting associations with both inflammation and lungs. And that food is fiber. And I think that fiber is one of the best places to start, and I'll give you 2 good reasons for that. One, we know that dietary fiber modulates inflammation throughout the body. And 2, most of us don't eat enough fiber. As you can see here, the general recommendations for fiber they vary by age and by sex, but the general target is anywhere from about 20 to 40 grams per day. I'd like to dive into this topic a little bit more by presenting some research from one of my colleagues at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, Dr. Mariah Jackson. She used the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is a population-based survey here in the United States that allows us to see what the general intake of adults like you and me look like. In her analysis of almost 1,900 people, she was able to see that more than 90% of those adults did not eat enough fiber. Additionally, when she looked at supplementation use, those same adults, less than 5% took a supplement. Now, why is this important? She found also in the same analysis that an increase of just 5 grams of fiber per day could decrease an inflammatory marker in your blood by 5%. Now, just think how significant that is. She also highlighted that there are specific people who are at risk, and that is beyond the 90% who are already not eating enough fiber. And those people are females, those with low education levels, and those with low income. So how is this possible? How is something that we eat able to decrease inflammation throughout the body? Well, first, you eat the fiber that's there in that top box. Second, the fiber is fermented or used as fuel by the bacteria in your small intestine. And those compounds influence immune signaling, which are these short-chain fatty acids. Those short-chain fatty acids that are coming from the fiber go on to support intestinal barrier, so the lining of your intestine. They regulate immune cells and therefore go out and control inflammation throughout the body. We also know we also have observational data from people on our research team that shows that people who eat more fiber have better lung function. Additionally, as we alluded to in the previous slide, people who eat more fiber have lower levels of inflammation in their blood. So what should Maya do with this information? The first thing I would say would be for Maya to add 1 add some fiber-rich food that she's not currently eating. Where is that found? That can be in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, beans, seeds. So what she could do would be maybe add some berries to breakfast, swap white rice for whole grain rice. If you're looking for packaged foods, you can see the serving size on this nutrition facts label. And fiber is found just here under the total carbohydrate intake. So you can see that 1 cup in this specific food, whatever it might be, has 4 grams of fiber. If you can remember back to the previous slides, we're looking for a target of about 20 to 40 grams per day. My goal is not to ask you to, if you're going from 0 to go to 20 to 40 grams per day, I'm asking you to start someplace. Remember, just that difference of 5 grams per fiber was able to show significant decreases of inflammation in the blood. So you don't have to change everything at once, just add one thing and continue on from there. Next, let's meet Ron. Ron is a 65-year-old male. He lives at home, but he has adult grown children. He recently retired, and it was a job that he had him quite active, and he regularly received meals at his job. Now that he's retired, he sleeps in most days, grazes throughout the days with some meals, and then maybe eats a larger meal in the evening if he feels like it. Sometimes it just ends up being some popcorn. He was diagnosed with sarcoidosis about 5 years ago and has multi-organ disease. And he recently completed a long course of steroids, which had him realize 2 things. Number 1, he's gaining weight. And number 2, he feels weak and tired. He mentioned this to his adult daughter, who brought over dinner the other night, who said she heard from a friend that patients who are on steroids need vitamin D and that he needs to start supplementing. So this brings up 2 concerns for us. Ron's 2 topics are going to be body composition and vitamin D metabolism. So let's start with his weight and his fatigue. One of the most important things that I want you to take away from my talk today is that muscle mass is not the same as weight. When you look down at the number of the scale, it's going to tell you the total body weight of things like fat, tissues, muscle mass, bone, and fluid within your body. What it doesn't tell you is how much of each one of those components is making up the total number. Muscle mass is extremely critical, and it's critical for your physical strength, your mobility, but it's also critical for your muscle health and your immune system regulation. And it is entirely possible for you to gain weight and still lose muscle mass, which is why Ron's question has become so important. I really want to illustrate this a bit further in this slide. And what you're looking at are CT scans of the 3rd lumbar of 2 different patients. So you see patient 1 on the top panel and patient 2 on the bottom panel. On the left-hand side of both panels are just a regular CT scan. The reason we use L3 is because we know that it is representative of your whole body's muscle mass. What we really will focus on is on the right side to notice that the green is fat tissue or fat mass, and the red is muscle mass. So the top patient has a BMI of 40. However, when you look specifically at the red ring around the abdomen, you can see how small that is. So even though this patient has a BMI of 40, which in our world we would consider to be clinically obese, he has a low muscle index. And we are actually able to quantify this through a calculation and measurement. And we can see that his muscle mass is low, which is below clinical guidance with an SMI of 46. Anything for a male less than 52 is what we would consider low muscle mass. On the other hand, we have a patient below. He has a BMI of 22.9. This is really what we consider to be a normal healthy weight, but a lot of times clinically, we think of this almost as thin. This patient has green, obviously, that you can see around the abdomen, but has a lot more abundance of that red muscle. This person has a healthy muscle index of 64.6. I use this to illustrate specifically that we can't tell based on your body or by looking at you on the outside how much muscle you have, and maintaining that muscle is critical for your strength, your ability to do actual daily livings that you enjoy doing. Research estimates that about 25 to 30% of patients have sarcoidosis, and that prolonged steroid therapy can actually lead to muscle wasting. So when we think about patients like Ron, our goal does not need to be only how do I get that number on the scale down? We also need to ask the question, how do we preserve muscle and function? A practical place for Ron to start is just by adding protein. So for someone like Ron, which is someone we would be not shocked to see in clinic, we would start asking him to eat protein more often throughout the day rather than at one large meal in the evening, or when you turn to snack foods and see them, kind of dwindle away as you go. So you can get those from anywhere that you like to get them. That could come from meat, seafood, eggs, but we can also search for places like grain, nuts, and seeds and legumes, which also would include fiber. You also have plant-based proteins on that bottom part there. We really want you to be intentional about including protein throughout the day for two reasons. First, the more times you expose your body to protein, or basically the more shots you take, the more total protein you're going to get in during the day. But second is for absorption. We know that the more times you eat protein or the more times that you have to introduce it to your body, the more that you're going to absorb and actually be able to do something beneficial with it. But Ron had another question. His second question was about vitamin D metabolism. His daughter thinks that this is really going to be beneficial for him and his energy levels. She thinks this is pretty much why he is feeling the way he's feeling. But vitamin D metabolism is a little bit more complicated in sarcoidosis, and we're going to cover that topic a little bit now. So as was discussed fully before, steroids can increase bone loss and risk of fracture. That is something that is known really well. And we also know that vitamin D has several health benefits. Those include your muscle function, calcium regulation, immune function, but as you can see on the top, also bone health. So it's really logical to assume that if steroids increase the risk of fracture and vitamin D improves your bone health, that more vitamin D should be better. And this is where vitamin D can behave differently in sarcoidosis. There are a few laboratory values that help us understand what's happening with vitamin D metabolism. So the first one we're going to talk about is 25-hydroxyvitamin D. This is the main storage form or inactive form of vitamin D. I like to think of this as the sleeping vitamin D. Sorry, I'm not used to a mic in my in my talks. So this is the major form that's tested when you would go to a primary care clinic. This is the most common form that's tested anytime your laboratory values are assessed. But there are more things that we need to consider here. The second is 125-dihydroxyvitamin D. And this is the active form. So when your body needs some active vitamin D, this is the form that is being active for you. And finally, there's parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone acts as your body's hormone regulator to let your body know when you need more active vitamin D or when your vitamin D can stay in bed and wait till it's needed later. So the reason I am bringing all of these labs up is that normal activation of vitamin D is usually really, really tightly regulated by your kidney, as illustrated in the top panel of this figure. However, in sarcoidosis, there are some granulomas that produce enzymes that can activate vitamin D outside of your kidney. I know that seems a little complicated, but basically, instead of one place that's forming active vitamin D, now you have two. That additional vitamin D activation can increase calcium absorption and also lead to higher calcium in the blood. So all of this to say that one laboratory value is not going to tell you the whole story of vitamin D in your sarcoidosis. Now, this slide is a little bit busy, and I do want to start with the caveat that I do not expect anyone in this room to go home and interpret your own labs. But I do want you to know, and I do know myself, that we live in an age where labs pop up on your phone like social media notifications, and then we immediately go to the internet and try to interpret them ourselves. So I want to just kind of give you a run through of what we're looking at and when your provider or your care team may consider versus when they may not consider vitamin D supplementation. So if we start here, at the bottom, what we're really going to look for is what is vitamin D deficiency and what is altered vitamin D metabolism in sarcoidosis. So, like we previously mentioned, if we were looking only at the inactive form, so that I'm looking, I don't know if I have a pointer. Yes, I do. So if we're looking only right here at the inactive form of vitamin D, say this is the only lab that's drawn, both patients who have vitamin D deficiency and altered vitamin D metabolism will look the same. So that's why we need to look a little bit further. If we're looking specifically at vitamin D metabolism, you will have a low inactive vitamin D. You will have very low active vitamin D. And your hormone regulator is like, please, please, can I have some more vitamin D? In this instance, your care team may consider supplementation. On the other hand, if you have altered vitamin D metabolism, which is in this second row here, your inactive vitamin D is low. And interestingly enough, your active vitamin D is high. And here at the very end, your parathyroid hormone is saying, for the love of God, please stop. In this instance, we would not probably consider vitamin D supplementation. All this to say, we do not recommend self-supplementation for vitamin D in anyone who has sarcoidosis. You should always discuss calcium and vitamin D testing with your care team, and that should include all three of these labs, not just this first inactive vitamin D that we looked at right here. If you're only looking at this one and your provider says, let's take some supplements to get your vitamin D back up, say, I was at this conference, I think we need to look a little bit further into my vitamin D to make the right call here. If supplementation is started, whether with your primary care provider or your sarcoidosis provider, just make sure that does result in ongoing testing and conversations. So Ron has some homework. What Ron needs to do tomorrow is to identify supplements he may be currently taking that could include vitamin D. That could be a multivitamin, simply vitamin D, and vitamin D plus calcium. What he should do is write down the supplement name, the dose, meaning how often do you take it and how many, and the vitamin D content as well as the calcium content of that supplement. Then when Ron goes to his care provider, no matter who they are, he has concrete evidence or concrete information that he can share with his care team about his supplementation. I do want you to know that vitamin D also comes from foods. Some of the richest sources are from fatty fish, such as trout and salmon, but it also comes from places like fortified milks, cereals, and bread. I want to be clear that this list is not a list of food that patients with sarcoidosis need to avoid. I bring this up simply so that you can be educated about where vitamin D comes from in addition to supplementation in sunlight. So finally, we are going to meet Elise. Elise is a 53-year-old female. She lives at home with her husband. She was diagnosed with sarcoidosis about 3 years ago. She follows a plant-forward diet and includes protein at each meal and snack, and she regularly checks her vitamin D status and calcium levels with her care team. But what Elise also wonders is what else might be worth thinking about. Elise's question is going to lead us to a nutrient that our research team is specifically interested in. And that nutrient is omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are a type of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they are essential. And what essential means is that your body does not make them by themselves. It's something that you need to eat through the diet so that it is in your body. There are different types of omega-3 fatty acids. So when you hear omega-3, then you also will probably hear buzzwords like ALA, EPA, DHA. Those come from different food sources. So you can see here on the right, ALA comes from plant sources mainly, while EPA and DHA come from marine sources. So those things like salmon, anchovies, tuna, etc. We know through research that EPA and DHA have multiple beneficial roles, including mediating inflammation. And recent research has told us that that's because they are precursors to metabolites called specialized pro-resolving mediators. You don't need to remember that, but these are metabolites that we know that actively regulate and resolve inflammation in your body. There has been a lot of research coming out lately regarding omega-3 fatty acids in the lung. We do know from work from others that increased blood levels are associated with slower lung function decline in patients with chronic lung disease. And our own work using the cardio lung cohort has shown that higher levels of specifically, I think we can highlight this here, EPA, DHA, and EPA plus DHA are associated with lower respiratory susceptibility risk scores. So that's a large way of saying that we can see that those higher levels are associated with a lower risk of bad outcomes later on. Another thing that we found that's really interesting is that some groups of people may see more benefit than others. So the further away from these dotted lines here, the more benefit someone's seeing. So you can see here in this example that Black participants saw more benefit of omega-3 fatty acids than white participants. When we think about omega-3 fatty acids and sarcoidosis, the evidence is a lot more limited. What we do know currently is that fatty acid profiles differ among patients with sarcoidosis. In fact, it appears that omega-3 fatty acid levels are lower, and especially lower in those with multisystem disease. We also know that omega-3s and metabolites, that buzzword that I used earlier, may help regulate inflammation by influencing specific immune cells involved in sarcoidosis. But there are a lot of things we don't know. We don't know if supplementation can treat sarcoidosis. We don't know what the appropriate dose is, and we don't know who will respond differently. So let's move on to what our team is studying. Our team, led by Dr. Michelle Sharp here at Johns Hopkins, is really interested in looking at omega-3 intake in patients with sarcoidosis and how that intake may relate to outcomes such as respiratory symptoms, quality of life, dyspnea, and functional status. So let's look at one specific analysis we did. We are looking at a group of patients. There were 65 of them who were about 58 years old and had the disease for 6 years. Most of them were white, half of them were female, the other half were male, and most of them they had an involvement with about 2 to 4 organs. We use the Dietary History Questionnaire 3, which is an online tool that allows us to estimate how much of each nutrient somebody eats per day. We do that by saying, how often do you eat this food and this food and this food? And it allows us to estimate exactly how many calories, protein, and individual nutrients a person consumes. So with doing that, we found that the group of 65 individuals that we're looking at here ate about 1,700 calories per day. So the very first thing we looked at was how much omega-3 fatty acids were patients with sarcoidosis eating. So when we are looking at this distribution of intake, we can see that the recommended daily intake for EPA and DHA is anywhere from 200 to 500 milligrams per day. Who here thinks that they got 200 or anywhere above 250 milligrams per day by a show of hands? Okay. I would say we're around the 5-ish range here in the in-person audience. This group of patients had a median intake of 75 milligrams per day when we're looking at specifically EPA plus DHA intake. So that is considerably lower and on the way lower end of the lower threshold of 250 milligrams per day. So the next thing we looked at was how did that intake relate to sarcoidosis outcomes? So what we found was that higher EPA and DHA intake was associated with lower odds of dyspnea. In other words, for every increase of EPA and DHA intake you had, your odds of shortness of breath went down. And I think I would like to just highlight how significant this finding is when the amount of omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA that were eaten, was this far below the recommended level. So nutrition is a hard science to study because things are so variable, but when we see a signal, when there's something with intake this low, it makes us very excited. So what does this mean? We know that EPA and DHA intake and dyspnea are associated. It is a really interesting signal that gives us a reason to keep studying this pathway. And what's next, we really want to look at how much omega-3 fatty acids are in the blood. Like I said, they are essential. So when we see them in the blood, we know we call them biomarkers because there's no other way they can get there except if you ate them. And we really want to see how those blood levels are associated with outcomes. So as Elise waits for us to do our research, what can she do tomorrow? The first thing I would recommend is identify sources of omega-3s and see where they can naturally fit into your dietary pattern. Then choose those omega-3 fatty acids recently until it does become a pattern and it's part of your normal daily life. As always, I do recommend you always talk to your provider before supplementing. What I'm recommending today is not that you go out and buy a supplement next. I think just starting with a pattern of adding omega-3 fatty acids to your diet is the best way to start. As you can see on the screen here are rich sources of omega-3, specifically EPA and DHA. And just for your awareness, I do have the vitamin D content of those foods on the right-hand column. But let's get back to where we started. Today, we met 3 patients. We met Maya, who was recently diagnosed and wanted to know what she could do for her inflammation through her diet. We met Ron, who had multi-organ disease, who's been on steroids and is gaining weight but feels weak and thought vitamin D might help. And we met Elise, who was diagnosed with sarcoidosis a year ago. She has already been doing lots of things right, but she wants to know what emerging research is telling us to do next. So why nutrition? I hope some of the information I shared today is able to show you how impactful nutrition can be in sarcoidosis. Unlike many things in a chronic disease, nutrition is something you have full control over. You have full control over that decision-making, dietary patterns, and what the next days may look like. So in summary, my recommendation, a great place to start is by adding fiber. And like I said, that is because we know fiber modulates inflammation in the body, and we know most of us aren't getting enough of it. Second, we need to maintain your muscle mass. We'd like you to start doing that by regularly eating protein throughout the day instead of saving it for one large meal. Always discuss vitamin D with your provider, and that includes all 3 of those tests that we discussed before, as well as any supplementation that may be currently happening or could happen in the future. And finally, add omega-3 fatty acid source where they make sense and start incorporating them into your dietary pattern. I would like to acknowledge our research team that is led by Dr. Michelle Sharp here at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Sarah Luby, who is a fellow that is really hard working on this team, Sarah Poole and Anna Jones. My additional collaborators for which the research that I presented today is listed here, and also the Cardian and Haynes cohorts that I mentioned in some of the research I provided as well.
Do kind of a short segments on different organ systems. So up first, we have Dr. Barney Stern from our neurology team. So Dr. Stern is a professor of neurology here at Johns Hopkins. He has a long-standing interest in neurosarcoidosis and has collaborated extensively with national and international sarcoidosis experts and organizations, and participated in clinical research efforts to better understand this neurological disorder. He has published and lectured extensively on this topic and has a national and international referral practice. He was invited as a participant at the 2015 NIH workshop on high-risk sarcoidosis, which led to a publication of research priorities for conditions such as neurosarcoidosis. He's been involved in activities of Neurosarcoidosis Consortium, a group of neurologists that are focused on clinical care and research and the clinical and led the consortium's effort to establish criteria for the clinical diagnosis of neurosarcoidosis. He was the lead author of the consortium's definition and consensus of the diagnostic criteria for neurosarcoidosis that were first published in 2018, and was a participating investigator in the consortium study on infliximab for treatment as well as other initiatives. He's co-investigator with our other neurosarcoidosis experts here at Hopkins, Dr. Carlos Perdo, on his NIH and NDS research study investigating the pathophysiology of neurosarcoidosis. He's also a founding member of the Scientific Advisory Board of FSR and continues to serve on the board. You deserve all of these accolades, Dr. Stern, so I want to make sure I read them fully, and we are so honored to be able to work with you here. So I will hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Kayla. Now that we're all guilty about lunch, we can go on to another topic. But I just want to say, why is this talk the most important talk of the day? If push comes to shove, for those of you with lung disease, you can always order some new lungs on Amazon. For those of you with heart disease, again, Amazon can provide a new heart. I don't know. I've never seen Amazon advertise brains and spinal cords. So we really have to work hard to maintain the health of your brain because everyone is here today because of their brain. So here we go. If we can.
Other way.
Here we go. So several disclosures. Probably the most important disclosure I have is, unfortunately, all of the drugs that I will be talking about today are not FDA approved for sarcoidosis, which is a major challenge in this field because of the rarity of the disease and the challenge of doing clinical research in this field. So you've heard about granulomas and the inflammatory process of sarcoidosis. But I just want to remind you that the granuloma is heterogeneous. There are multiple types of cells that are sort of sitting there and misbehaving, if you will. But I also want to point out that at least when it comes to the nervous system, we see inflammation extending along blood vessels that go into the brain, into the spinal cord, and these are microscopic areas that you can't see with the naked eye. But importantly, because of those inflammatory cells that are sitting around these small blood vessels, the blood can clot. And when the blood clots, you can't get nutrition, again, as we were talking about, to the brain, and you could get microscopic strokes. And once the brain has sustained a microscopic stroke, as they accumulate, you get permanent neurological problems. And so our goal as neurologists is to try to preserve the function of the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves by decreasing the inflammation, allowing the blood and other nutrients to access the areas that they have to access and maintain brain health. So upwards of 30% of patients with sarcoidosis may have neurologic problems. Patients with known systemic sarcoidosis can develop neurologic problems, or patients can present with neurologic problems that are found to be due to sarcoidosis. And about 50% of patients who have neurosarcoidosis present with their sarcoidosis disease because of a neurologic problem. And that's part of the challenge of diagnosis, rapid assessment, and rapid initiation of treatment before irreparable damage can develop, affecting the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. So when someone first presents, they could present in a variety of ways, as I'll enumerate on the next slide. But historically, with time, if you present, let's say, with brain disease, you may develop spine disease, spinal cord disease. You may develop peripheral nerve disease. You may develop optic nerve disease. So with time, your disease manifestations can become more complex, making treatment more challenging and disability more of a threat. So essentially, any part of the nervous system can be afflicted by sarcoidosis, which is one of the intriguing aspects of this disease. The cranial nerves, your ability to smell, your ability to see, your ability to feel things on your face, your ability to move your face, your ability to hear, your ability not to be dizzy, are all things that can be affected by sarcoidosis. You could get inflammation along the lining of the brain, affecting the spinal fluid, causing headaches, causing obstruction of spinal fluid flow, leading to something called hydrocephalus. And you could get involvement in the substance of the brain, causing confusion, trouble speaking, trouble with your memory, altered behavior, altered personality, seizures. All of these things can go wrong with neurologic complications. In the spinal cord, in the extreme, you could get paralysis. You can get disruption of normal bladder and bowel function. You can get numbness in your legs. Again, maintaining the integrity of the spinal cord is critical. The peripheral nerves, as they exit the spinal cord and go out into the body, can be affected. You can get more localized areas of numbness or weakness. And then the muscle itself can be inflamed and be weak. So it's a very varied presentation, and we have to be sort of on our game to figure out what's going on here. Parenthetically, when I was in training, we usually thought of sarcoidosis as a disease of people in their 20s to 40s. Now we're seeing it in 50s, 60s, and 70s. And what that makes the challenge for us as neurologists is we're not only interested in figuring out what's going on with sarcoidosis, but we have to keep in mind all the neurologic afflictions of aging that can also manifest in patients as they go on in years. We usually don't think of sarcoidosis as a disease that could cause stroke, but in fact, we have seen this. And sarcoidosis can be thought of as what's called a hypercoagulable state. The blood can be too sticky. We can see blood clots in the small vessels, as I spoke about earlier. We know that the heart can be affected by sarcoid. Blood clots can go from the heart up to the brain, causing a stroke. And occasionally we even see bleeding in the brain from inflammation of the blood vessels, that those blood vessels then weaken and blood spews out into the brain itself. Headache is quite common among patients with sarcoidosis. It could be caused by a variety of things that we all have. 20% of the population has migraine. So we say, oh, well, maybe the headache is due to migraine. But many of the sarcoid population, as you know, are immunosuppressed, susceptible to infection. Does a new headache represent a new infection? Is there an obstruction of spinal fluid flow? Is there sarcoid inflammation of the fluid surrounding the brain causing pain? Have those granulomas coalesced into a large mass? And is that causing a headache? And finally, you can get an affliction of the trigeminal nerve, the sensory nerves that go out onto the face, but they also send fibers to the lining of around the brain, inside the skull, and that probably can cause headache too. So again, we have to be on top of our game in trying to sort out what the cause of someone's headache is all about. And then we have this unusual but terribly common affliction, which some have called paraneurosarcoidosis or non-granulomatous presentations, which are probably due to the high circulating immune proteins in the blood. And they can cause what's called a small fiber neuropathy, affecting the feet, the legs, the hands, the arms, and the torso. You can get an autonomic neuropathy so that you don't sweat properly, your blood pressure control is off, your bladder control is off, your GI tract function is off. Brain fog. I just don't feel right. I feel like I have the flu. I'm just not thinking clearly. Part of this constellation of symptoms, and then fatigue. Fatigue can be caused by many, many things, all the way from obesity or obstructive sleep apnea or low thyroid hormone, but fatigue can also be a primary brain manifestation of sarcoidosis. We're seeing small fiber neuropathy in perhaps 50% of the sarcoid population. Again, classically, it's in the hands, arms, feet, legs, but it could really be a whole segment of the body or literally all over. And it's often missed on casual examination unless you sort of know what you're looking for. And again, these autonomic manifestations, the autonomic nervous system is wired with so-called small fibers and therefore can also be afflicted in sarcoidosis. In medicine, we always say the name of the game is the diagnosis. And on this and the next slide are all the many of the diagnoses we have to consider when we're thinking about sarcoidosis and neurosarcoidosis in particular. And the yellow highlighted items are those that are particularly important in today's world in sort of saying, could this patient have X, Y, or Z, and as opposed to sarcoidosis? We're always concerned about other rare inflammatory processes as well as cancer. Many of you who are afflicted with neurosarcoidosis know that a critical aspect of our assessment is what the brain or spinal cord MRI looks like. On this slide, you can see the myriad sort of presentations of brain sarcoidosis. And the key here is those areas in white, if I can do this, doesn't really show up, I'm sorry, but you can see the red arrows pointing to areas of white. Those areas of white shouldn't be there. And so what we're looking for is with treatment, does that whiteness approach grayness? And that's sort of the name of the game as we monitor your clinical course with an MRI. The blood vessels can be involved, and as I've said, and these subtle changes on this MRI, those dark lines that are going across the brain show dilated what should be microscopic blood vessels sort of dilating or increasing in size because of the inflammatory process that we're seeing. The spinal cord can be involved, and again, the red arrows are pointing to those areas of white which shouldn't be there. And so imaging is absolutely critical to our ability to diagnose and monitor the clinical course of our patients. So I sort of alluded to, how do we know? Up until about 2018, there was no sort of generally accepted way of approaching the diagnosis of neurosarcoidosis. And at that point in 2018, a consensus group of neurologists, pulmonologists came across and said, we think this is a reasonable approach until we have a specific diagnostic marker for neurosarcoid, which in 2026, we still do not have. So the key is we want to make sure there's no infection, there's no malignancy, and we want to make sure we've considered all those other diagnoses that I highlighted previously. Possible neurosarcoidosis is a patient who present with features that look like sarcoidosis, but we don't have pathologic proof of granulomas anywhere in the body. Probable is we have neurologic features, but let's say a lymph node in the chest shows granulomas consistent with sarcoid. We make the leap that what's going on in the chest and that lymph node is going on in the central nervous system. And let me see what happened. skipped a slide somewhere. I apologize. Definite neurosarcoid is when we actually have a biopsy from an area of inflammation in the central nervous system showing granulomas. But because of where the brain is, where the spinal cord is, it's not a trivial process to get a biopsy. And the brain it's like real estate. It's location, location, location. And you don't want to take a chunk of brain or a chunk of spinal cord unless you absolutely have to. So that's the challenge here. Clinical course. Most of our patients overall do well. They may have an episode of inflammation around the brain. They may have a facial nerve paralysis. They tend to do well. But about a third of patients, the patients who I see, have major neurologic problems with inflammation of the brain or spinal cord, the optic nerve, the nerve that goes to the inner ear or hearing, peripheral neuropathies, hydrocephalus. And these are our challenging patients who stick around with us and have years and years of follow-up because their disease varies over time. Management. Corticosteroids have been with us a long time. They are still the fastest acting treatment we can get. They're cheap. Everyone can access them. But as you all know, they have a lot of side effects. And so what we're doing, like our pulmonary and cardiology colleagues, is that we're starting to add other drugs very early in the course of neurosarcoid to decrease the dose of prednisone or another steroid treatment. And that's part of our goal. And now we're even using so-called biologics quite early in patients who we can predict will have a challenging clinical course ahead of them. So if we're thinking about just a peripheral facial nerve palsy, 2, 3, 4 weeks of prednisone may be all that you need, and then you're on your way. But in severe disease, we may have to give intravenous high-dose steroids to squash the disease, try to prevent that irreparable damage that I mentioned earlier. We're oftentimes now starting right away with a TNF-alpha antagonist called infliximab to try to decrease the inflammatory process. We'll often begin methotrexate or a similar drug, but methotrexate can take weeks or a few months to kick in. But corticosteroids and infliximab really could put the kibosh on an active inflammatory process. That being said, when things are stabilized, we tend to decrease medication slowly, at least in my personal experience. If you go too fast, the patient relapses and you have to start over again. And that's part of the art of medicine. As I've said, they're traditional immunosuppressive drugs. On this list, you may see some of your favorites or has-beens. But we try to avoid those drugs that we know can cause ill effects on organs that are already involved, let's say, in sarcoid, such as the liver. But now this talk was entitled Neurosarcoidosis 101. This is now graduate level therapies. And that's what we're using with the so-called TNF alpha inhibitors, infliximab, adalimumab, monoclonal antibodies to an inflammatory protein called IL-6, JAK inhibitors, which are sort of more of a shotgun approach, but very powerful in terms of the inflammatory process we're just now starting to use. And even on rare occasions, if there's a mass lesions, we have tried radiation therapy to quiet things down. For small fiber neuropathy, we have, as I mentioned, even less rigorous information, but anecdotally, adalimumab, a TNF-alpha drug, is our go-to medication. Intravenous immunoglobulin can be used to decrease the activity of the inflammatory process. At times, we've used combinations of TNF inhibitors and IVIG, immunoglobulin. And we've also now been using an IL-6 antagonist and just starting to look at so-called JAK inhibitors. But it's not just treating with those drugs. We're very attuned to trying to treat the discomfort that these patients can be incapacitated by, as well as the treatment of autonomic nervous system dysfunction, GI motility, bladder function, bowel function. Future needs. We have to optimize multidisciplinary patient care. We have to be attuned to diagnostic accuracy. Is sarcoidosis one disease or is it many diseases? Sarcoidoses, as I've sort of pirated that term. What drives disease involvement in any particular organ, such as the central nervous system? Do we have any diagnostic markers that are generally accepted? At this point, not to my knowledge. Do we have any markers that tell us how a patient will be doing? And if it's elevated, we may want to go slow with medication withdrawal. If the marker is good, maybe we could come down quicker with medications. How do we measure disease activity? How do we measure outcomes of patients that are meaningful to patient care? In other words, if I say to you, Mrs. Jones, we're so happy your MRI now doesn't have any of that white stuff anymore, but you're sitting in your chair and you can't walk, you're going to say to me, so what? I still can't go to the kitchen. So we need things that are relevant to the patient. Good quality of life scales, neurocentric markers, meaning things that are pertinent to the neurologist, but also pertinent to the entire function of the body. And we have to think of novel treatments based on the underlying science of this disease, maybe using multi-drug strategies like we're doing more and more of, and aiming ultimately to personalized medicine. So here at Hopkins, we really have a multidisciplinary team where we talk, sometimes argue, but usually interact very constructively on each of your behalves so that we really try to come up with the best stew, the best menu for any one patient. And so with our multidisciplinary team approach, which as you can see involves a whole bunch of people, we learn from each other. We toss out our ideas. We research things together. And we try as a team to do the best we can for our patients. Finally, we are involved in research. We've been fortunate here at Hopkins and with colleagues at University of California, San Francisco, to have the first NIH-funded study, which is still funded, and to look at the underlying basic science of central nervous system sarcoidosis, so that maybe in 5 years, we'll be much more advanced and much more savvy in what we're saying. So there's a lot of white on this slide, which to me says there's a lot more to be learned about the inflammatory process of this disease and the therapeutic options. So again, in 5 or 10 years, there'll be less white, more knowledge, and hopefully patients will be doing better. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stern. So we are going to save all the questions for the round robin speakers for the multidisciplinary panel. So write down your questions so you don't forget them for Dr. Stern, and then we will come to those at the panel discussion. All right. So up next, we have Dr. Nisha Galotra, who is an associate professor of medicine and advanced heart failure and transplant cardiologist here at Johns Hopkins, where she's the director of heart failure disease management and the Johns Hopkins Cardiac Sarcoidosis Program. Dr. Galotra, received her medical degree from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She completed her medical residency, including a chief resident year as assistant chief of service of the Osler Medical Service, general cardiology fellowship, and advanced heart failure fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Her clinical and research focus is in inflammatory cardiomyopathies, specifically improving and investigating diagnostic and therapeutic strategies, clinical outcomes, and advanced heart failure therapies in sarcoidosis and myocarditis. She additionally has a passion for working in an interdisciplinary fashion to improve and innovate evidence-based care delivery for patients with heart failure. So with that, I will ask Dr. Galocha to come on up.
Thank you, Kayla. So the goal for the next 30 minutes or so is for me to convince you that the heart is more important than the brain. So we will describe how sarcoidosis can involve the heart. We will talk about how one might present, what symptoms they might have if the heart is involved. We'll talk about a slew of medical testing and how we make the diagnosis. And then we'll talk about how we monitor and treat cardiac involvement. So you all are very familiar with how sarcoidosis can involve pretty much any part of our body. We'll focus on the heart for the next 30 minutes or so. I think it's important to point out that not every heart condition in someone who has sarcoidosis is sarcoidosis, right? And so reminding your physicians, your providers, if you're presenting in the emergency room, to just think about the bread and butter common cardiac conditions like coronary artery disease and other things. And so, this was a large population in Europe of patients with sarcoidosis in general, and they show that patients with sarcoidosis have an increased risk of having heart failure or cardiomyopathy and having atrial arrhythmias, which are very common in the general population as well, but at a heightened risk, whether that's related to cardiac involvement or not. But when we talk about actual cardiac involvement of sarcoidosis, how common is that? So most of the literature to date will report that clinically manifest cardiac involvement occurs in about 5% of patients. I know with this audience and those of you seeing us in clinic, it might feel like it's more than that. But notably, clinically silent cardiac involvement can occur in over a quarter of patients, even half of patients, when we look at imaging or pathology studies. And then in a small subset of patients, sarcoidosis can be isolated to the heart. And so that's when maybe clinically only the heart is involved. We don't detect inflammation or we don't have a biopsy elsewhere in the body. And it's usually a more advanced presentation, which goes hand in hand with the heart being the only organ involved. But again, this is a small subset of patients and requires a thorough look at other causes of heart inflammation. We've seen with time that cardiac involvement is increasingly being detected. It's probably for a couple of different reasons. One is our diagnostic techniques have just improved. Our imaging, such as cardiac MRI and PET imaging, which we'll talk about, has made a lot of headway in the last 10 years. And also awareness, right? So events like this and us as a medical community learning more about sarcoidosis and spreading the word has been really important to then look for cardiac involvement. Know that you're not alone. So this is a summary of kind of our cohort of about 500 patients or so from the cardiac sarcoidosis program here. And you'll see in general that we have about 42% are female, 40% Black. Age at cardiac sarcoidosis, and this is to Dr. Stern's point too earlier, is 53. So older than what we typically say is a usual presentation for sarcoidosis in general. And our patients may have a myriad of manifestations. A third will have heart failure. A fifth will have ventricular arrhythmias. But other organ involvement is also very common. And in a small subset of patients, you may need an ablation, which we'll talk about. You may need a heart transplantation. But just know that this is a cohort of patients we're seeing at more of our advanced practice, and so things are kind of skewed towards that. But there are many patients living with this condition. So when do we suspect heart involvement? So when you're being evaluated for sarcoidosis and have other organs involved, we definitely are thinking about, could the heart be involved when you have primary cardiac manifestations? So maybe the heart pump is not squeezing as efficiently. Also commonly, a common word that's used is heart failure, or when you have an abnormal heart rate or heart rhythm. And so for our patients, how does that feel? So you might have symptoms of heart racing or palpitations. You might feel short of breath because the heart's not working as efficiently. And of course, that needs to be distinguished from our lung symptoms. You might have a chest pain syndrome or fainting or what we call syncope, where you lose consciousness briefly. And so how do we then juxtapose that with our clinical diagnoses? So those extra heartbeats may be due to arrhythmias, like PVCs or ventricular arrhythmias. You might feel lightheaded or dizzy because of actually slowing of the heart conduction system, and having bradycardia. And then you might have that shortness of breath or functional limitations because of that heart muscle weakness or cardiomyopathy. So other things, again, to consider, common things being common: coronary artery disease, if you have the right risk profile. A family history is really important to think about. Inherited heart conditions, other causes of inflammation in the heart. So you'll hear the word myocarditis frequently, kind of hand in hand with cardiac sarcoidosis, because it causes inflammation in the heart. So literally myo being muscle, card for the heart, and itis, like an arthritis, right? You can get inflammation in the heart muscle. And then there are other infiltrative cardiomyopathies that we think about. Some of you may have been worked up for these, like amyloidosis, other things that can deposit in the heart and mimic sarcoidosis. All right, so whether you present with cardiac manifestations first or other organ manifestations first, you might have a very different experience with this condition. So this was a cohort of our patients that we looked at, 250 patients. About half of them presented de novo with the heart involved first, and half where they had known extracardiac sarcoidosis. And so the de novo cardiac patients were more likely to be white, younger, and have a more overt cardiac presentation. Males were more common than females to have also coronary artery disease and ventricular tachycardia, whereas females were more likely to have skin and eye involvement, and heart failure symptoms. So depending on how you present, there may be some kind of classic differentiations. And then some racial differences that we saw: Black patients were more likely to have diabetes, present with heart failure, and also have a history of prior known sarcoidosis. All right, so that's background on how you might present. So transitioning to how we make the diagnosis. So these are the two main diagnostic criteria that we use. There's the Heart Rhythm Society and then the Japanese Circulation Society. And they require a combination of, again, the clinical presentation we reviewed, cardiac imaging findings, and then biopsy if we have that information. This is very busy. This is how nuanced it is in terms of kind of thinking through the process. You do not need to memorize this, but just to show it. And then we'll go through some of the approaches to making the diagnosis. So a heart biopsy or an endomyocardial biopsy is technically the gold standard, because that's how then you can see the tissue that confirms sarcoidosis. And what we typically see, as pictured here, is this non-caseating granuloma. Let's see if this works. In the kind of the center of the slide there. And then the purple cells are the inflammatory cells that shouldn't be there, and all the pink is normal heart tissue. The issue with this is sarcoidosis is a patchy process. Anyone who has had a PET scan has seen these reads, and they'll often say patchy inflammation. And when we do an endomyocardial biopsy, we're biopsying a very specific part of the heart, and so we often miss it. So I like to lean heavily on my colleagues in pulmonary primarily, but if there's another biopsy site, like through a bronchoscopy or a skin biopsy, we try to go for that first. We will do an endomyocardial biopsy if we're thinking of other diagnoses that we need to evaluate, like amyloidosis or other causes of myocarditis. So these are just some more pictures of what the pathology can look like in sarcoidosis of the heart. And then things that you may do in terms of testing. So EKG we'll start with. So this is a very common cardiac test. It's done right in the office. It takes about 60 seconds or less. It's just a one-time snapshot of the electrical activity in your heart. And it provides us immediate information about how the electrical conduction is going through the heart, as well as the heart rhythm. Prolonged cardiac rhythm testing is done through a couple of different mechanisms. The most common one we use now is a cardiac patch monitor, which you can kind of stick on and wear for anywhere from 1 day to 14 days, or even longer than that. It can be set up while you're in clinic with us, or the box can be mailed to you to set up. Many of you have done this multiple times. And you also get a patient diary. So if you have an episode of lightheadedness or palpitations, you can note that. And then when our heart doctors review the actual data, they can line it up with symptoms. An implantable loop recorder, I want to point out, is a longer term device that some of my colleagues in the EP lab actually implant just under the skin. And that can have a battery of 3 years. And so that can be used to more long-term monitor the heart rhythm. An echocardiogram is also a very common test we do. This is a sonogram or an ultrasound of the heart. It can help assess your heart function or how well it's pumping, and then also our heart valves. And sarcoidosis has many possible findings. So they're black and white pictures, primarily from a sonogram. We can see enlargement of the heart or thickening of the heart muscle, hypertrophy. We can see aneurysms in sarcoidosis. We can see a pericardial effusion, which is fluid around the heart from inflammation, as well as valve involvement. So another test that we can do is a right heart catheterization. This is helpful not only for the heart, but to assess the lung pressures as well. This is a procedure that takes about 30 minutes. It's done in a cardiac catheterization lab through the vein up in our neck. It goes straight to our heart. So through an IV, we're able to measure the pressures both on the right side of the heart, in the lungs, and on the left side of the heart. Pulmonary hypertension is something else that can be a manifestation of sarcoidosis, either due to heart involvement and kind of a secondary manifestation, due to lung involvement in a secondary manifestation, or the blood vessels in the lungs can actually be affected by sarcoidosis and cause pulmonary hypertension. And so this is the kind of gold standard diagnostic test to measure the pressures in the lung arteries and make a diagnosis of pulmonary hypertension as well. And then moving on to our advanced imaging studies. So if we have a high enough suspicion that there's cardiac involvement in the heart, we'll proceed to doing a heart MRI. A heart MRI gives us a more sensitive or accurate assessment of the heart function, how well the muscle is squeezing both on the right and the left side, and then something called late gadolinium enhancement. So when you get this test, you get a little contrast injection with gadolinium. And then basically what we're looking at is, your heart muscle cells should all be nice and tightly like this. And if there's inflammation or infiltration in between those muscle cells, it takes longer for that gadolinium to wash out from the heart muscle. And so what we're looking at is this delayed or late gadolinium enhancement, which tells us that there might be some scarring, some fibrosis, or even inflammation. And sarcoidosis is a typical pattern on MRI. In terms of inflammation, there's also particular pictures we look at for active inflammation as well. And then a famed favorite, I'm sure, for many in the audience, the PET scan, the infamous PET scan. So why do I put you through this time and time again? So the PET scan is really helpful for us to know, not only from a diagnostic standpoint, but also from a therapeutic standpoint as we monitor inflammation. Here we do a cardiac and whole body PET scan along with a perfusion scan. So it's 2 parts. The FDG is kind of like a sugar analog, so to speak. And when we inject that, there's certain parts of our body that are just actively metabolically active, and the heart is one of them. So if we sent us through the PET scanner today with that, all of our hearts would light up just naturally if we haven't been doing the right diet. So this diet that we put you through ahead of time, it puts the heart into kind of a fasting state so that it doesn't take up falsely the tracer. And like I mentioned, it's helpful for the time of diagnosis, because if we see lymph nodes that are involved or other parts of the body, that's just more diagnostic evidence that that this is sarcoidosis, especially when we're working with those cases that are primarily affecting the heart and can be a target for biopsy sites as well. There's a classic mismatch pattern where an area of the heart that is actively inflamed, or there's FDG uptake in the bottom row there, the perfusion will be reduced. So basically the blood flow is more impaired in that area because it's actively inflamed. And that's what we look for. So this is an example of a very active PET scan where you see the bright yellow spots. That's the left ventricle that's lighting up, but you can see it's not evenly lighting up, right? It's more patchy. There's some areas that are more bright than others. We do know that these PET images are helpful over time because they do correlate with response to treatment. So in this study, as PET inflammation improved over time, patients had a better response in their heart function and their clinical presentation. This is a graph showing improved LVEF, or ejection fraction. Those of you with cardiomyopathy are familiar with that. So we'll pivot now to treatment along the range of active inflammation, how we deal with the scar that's in the heart, and then more advanced cases. So as you've heard many times today already, immunosuppression is the mainstay. But unfortunately, in cardiac sarcoidosis, like neurosarcoidosis, we don't have any FDA-approved treatments. And so we do a lot of borrowing from other conditions and from systemic sarcoidosis. So I won't go through all the details of treatment because you've heard quite a bit already. But I will share with you what we do know about heart treatment. So generally speaking, corticosteroids work. This was a pooled analysis of about 300 patients. The key finding that improved is actually the response to heart block. So when the heart conduction system is slowed. We do know that a higher dose is not necessarily better. So that is good news. So for the heart, we're not typically doing the high pulse dose steroids, for example. There have been several studies that have looked at kind of that 30 to 40 milligram range of prednisone versus much higher doses, and not really seen a difference there. But we do know that introducing steroid sparing agents up front is helpful and allows us to get down on those prednisone doses. I'll show you, our experience with using mycophenolate or Cellcept up front here led to a reduction in the maximum dose of prednisone exposure. That's the bar graph there. So patients treated only with prednisone, it's kind of more historic practice here at Hopkins, versus introducing a steroid sparing agent, in this case mycophenolate, up front, really exposed our patients to less corticosteroids with similar or even better improvement in PET and echo findings. But, ironically, we still haven't really rigorously answered this question. And so colleagues in Canada, Dr. Burney, who leads the Heart Rhythm Society guidelines, they're currently conducting a prospective clinical trial with methotrexate, looking at low-dose prednisone plus methotrexate up front compared to our traditional kind of prednisone up front only for 6 months, with primary outcomes being PET outcomes. So hopefully we'll be hearing about the results of this study in the next year or so. Now transitioning over to biologic agents. So you also heard about these earlier. These are important. Primarily the TNF alpha pathway is important in the granulomatous inflammation that we see in sarcoidosis. I will just highlight here that you may note or you might hear about the fact that these medications have an FDA black box warning for heart failure. Now, the reason for that is because in the early 2000s, for just broad heart failure, so someone could have had a heart attack and have cardiomyopathy or heart failure. They did studies looking at high doses of infliximab and etanercept and found a worse signal in terms of survival and outcomes. And so that's what brought the black box warning. But we know the efficacy in cardiac sarcoidosis. So several of us in the field in the early kind of late 20 teens put together individual case series of patients and really saw a tremendous benefit of introducing these agents in a timely fashion for patients with cardiac involvement of sarcoidosis. So this was our experience at Hopkins and Georgetown MedStar combined, where you can see the red dots represent the prednisone dose over time. So our patients came in to getting infliximab or adalimumab at an average dose of prednisone 21 milligrams, and by a year we're on 7 milligrams on average. And then all of the PET markers were improved for the first time as well in patients who otherwise had resistant inflammation. We're also really excited to be participating in, I think, what is the only prospective clinical trial in cardiac sarcoidosis in terms of drug treatment in the US right now with us in Mayo Clinic, where we're borrowing what we know with medication called rilonacept. So rilonacept is an interleukin-1 inhibitor. It's used in recurrent pericarditis. So that's inflammation around the heart muscle. And we've also kind of off-label used it in genetic causes of myopericarditis and had a very favorable effect from that. And so we are now looking at patients who are on oral therapy, but then have ongoing inflammation in the heart, and seeing if rilonacept compared to our usual kind of tweaks of the oral therapy standard of care might have a beneficial effect. So it's a kind of think of it as a 6-month interval, like we do clinically, right? Where we try a treatment for cardiac sarcoidosis and then we reassess things in 6 months. And then based on that, we pivot. So we're actively enrolling at Hopkins and Mayo for this. So generally our approach, again, this is busy, but starting up at the top, that prednisone 30 to 40 milligrams, really trying to start a steroid sparing agent orally up front. And then every 3 to 6 months reassessing things, but thinking about biologic agents early on. And again, as Dr. Stern pointed out, a lot of collaboration with our multidisciplinary team to come up with the best strategy for each individual patient. And then how we monitor is key, and that really guides how we adjust treatment. So we talked about serial FDG PET imaging. We talked about clinical disease activity. So we might do serial echocardiograms to look at your heart function. We are looking at your ICDs or pacemakers for any new arrhythmias. And if you don't have an ICD or pacemaker, we might be doing a heart monitor like I described. Can we de-escalate immunosuppression? So this is, again, $1 million question. Our goal is really to minimize prednisone as our primary goal when we're thinking about immunosuppression and figuring out what oral combination of agents or biologics are going to work to control things. And then once we do that, then trying to wean to whatever our minimal dosing is. So it's always kind of a risk benefit and why we monitor things very closely. Okay, so let's talk briefly now about the specific cardiac condition. So the 3 cardinal kind of manifestations we'll go through. So conduction disease or heart block. So first, an early 2nd-degree heart block don't necessarily require an intervention, but more advanced degrees of heart block may require a pacemaker. So what you see here is a picture of the heart, and the blue lines going through and the dots are how our electrical system talks to each other. And so why is that important? That tells our top chamber of the heart when to contract or squeeze, and then when for our bottom chamber to contract. And also for our bottom chamber to contract in a synchronized manner. Some of you may have heard of having a bundle branch block. So that means that there is a delay in the right to left kind of conduction in the ventricle that can make the heart less efficient. And so when patients present with advanced conduction disease, there's only a few things that cause this. So we're frequently thinking about sarcoidosis as a cause. And then we have the opposite of the end of the spectrum where your heart's going fast. So that's tachycardia. So that can either be the top chamber of the heart going fast, the atrium, which can be atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. It's common in many heart conditions. And how we treat this is with medications. We might consider an ablation and a blood thinner to prevent strokes that Dr. Stern also mentioned can happen. And then the ventricular tachycardias, that's the bottom chamber, the meat of the heart. That can be something that causes you to pass out. That can be hemodynamically unstable and actually cause cardiac arrest if it's sustained. And so this is where we think about a defibrillator. Ventricular tachycardia can occur when the heart is irritated from acute inflammation. So it can be what you might first present with, or it can be due to scar later in stages of the disease process. And so we use a variety of antiarrhythmic medications in addition to a defibrillator, which is basically an insurance policy essentially, right? It's monitoring your heart constantly. If it goes into an unsafe heart rhythm, it can treat you or pace you out of it. And then we may consider an ablation. So this is the implantable cardiac device that I talked about. These are usually same-day procedures requiring light sedation. Again, the device can play an active role, like pacing the heart fast enough to keep up with your daily demands, or it can just be there as a background monitoring things and there to check in when needed. You'll have regular monitoring for this, and every 5 to 10 years, you might need a battery replaced. What about cardiomyopathy? So this is what I specialize in. The word heart failure is, something that we're really moving away from using commonly, but you'll hear it a lot. Just don't love the way it sounds. We are heart success doctors. And so I like to use the word cardiomyopathy because I think it's much more broad. And that basically is there's something abnormal with the way the heart muscle is structured or how it pumps. Your ejection fraction is a number that you'll hear a lot about. That's the percent of blood that's pumped with each heartbeat. My kids are headed back to the first day of school this week, so I just want to point out this is not a test we're trying to score 100% on. The ejection fraction is normal when it's 55, 60%. And then in sarcoidosis, the heart function can be reduced or cardiomyopathy can be present, again, in the acute throes of inflammation, and it can get better, or due to scarring. So what you might experience, you might have fatigue, you might have, when the pump is not working as efficiently, fluid backs up. So you might have leg swelling, abdominal bloating, you might not feel as hungry, you might be gaining weight, which often we have to differentiate from that lovely prednisone we start. Shortness of breath. When you get short of breath lying flat to sleep, or you notice you have to prop yourself up on more pillows, that is more specific to fluid from the heart causing shortness of breath compared to a lung cause of shortness of breath. So that's a very helpful symptom to monitor for. So things that we look for, we might look at your neck veins. Sometimes I feel like a photographer in clinic, turn a little bit more to the left, chin up. That vein, the jugular venous pressure is what we're estimating because it directly connects to the heart. We might look for an enlarged right heart, edema, which is leg swelling, signs on your abdominal exam, like fluid in your belly, and then for murmurs as well. Treatment for cardiomyopathy, I'm putting up a couple names of medications. These are our guideline-directed medical therapies, not specific to sarcoidosis, but that we use broadly in cardiomyopathy or weakening of the heart muscle. Independent of sarcoidosis, these help improve the squeeze or the heart function. And then very rarely, patients can need progression or evaluation for progression for advanced heart failure therapies. Just to know that these options are available, including heart transplantation, which we do here, and as well as a heart pump or a left ventricular assist device that patients can go home with. But know that overall, heart function does stay stable. So for the most part, over 82% of our patients had stable or improved ejection fraction over time. If you start with a reduced ejection fraction or start with complete heart block, those patients tended to have the least improvement in their ejection fraction over time. So I briefly mentioned cardiomyopathy surgeries for refractory cardiomyopathy or arrhythmia. Sometimes if you are very sick in the hospital, you might need these temporary heart pumps to support the heart. Luckily, we have a way to support the heart mechanically. You may need the heart pump that you can actually go home with, a left ventricular assist device, or a heart transplantation. And the times we think about this is if we've kind of been through all of our treatments, for example, for ablations, the cardiomyopathy medications I mentioned, if you're requiring IV medications to increase the heart pumping function, this is not something that you'll wake up tomorrow and need. Okay, this is a conversation that we start early if we're headed in that direction. or you're hospitalized and we're moving in that direction. So to sum up, the heart can be involved in sarcoidosis. It requires a high index of suspicion to think about. Our clinical manifestations include cardiomyopathies and heart rhythm abnormalities more commonly. We love our advanced cardiac imaging because it helps with diagnosis, monitoring our treatment response, and also tells us about risk of future clinical events. And we're grateful for our patients who participate in clinical trials because that's really lacking in our field to improve the path forward in terms of treatment strategies for patients with cardiac sarcoidosis. So with that, I'll end and thank our whole team and particularly our patients.
Thank you, Dr. Galotra. And quick, as Becca is helping me load the next slides, if we can just turn all phones onto silent ringer, just for we don't avoid any further interruptions, I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. All right, so to close out our round robin before we move to the expert panel question and answer, where you guys will have a dedicated time to ask your questions, we have Dr. Kristen Mathias from Rheumatology. So Dr. Kristen Mathias is a physician scientist in the Division of Rheumatology. She completed her residency in internal medicine at the University of Chicago, followed by fellowship training in rheumatology here at Johns Hopkins. During her fellowship, Dr. Mathias also earned a Master's of Health Science in Clinical Investigation from the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and obtained certification in musculoskeletal ultrasound through U.S. SONAR program. She subsequently joined the faculty here at Hopkins, and her clinical and research interests focus on sarcoidosis and scleroderma. In sarcoidosis, her work centers on reducing glucocorticoid toxicity and promoting early use of steroid-sparing therapies in patients with multi-organ involvement. In scleroderma, she is particularly interested in the early detection of interstitial lung disease and in developing tools to support complex decision-making for patients and providers. She sees patients in both the Hopkins Sarcoidosis Center and the Hopkins Scleroderma Center. She is an active member of the American College of Rheumatology and of ASOG. With that, I would like to bring up Dr. Mathias to join us.
Other one.
Yep, there you go.
All right. Thank you for that kind introduction, Kayla, and thank you to all the organizers for putting on such an excellent event. They say save the best for last, so I'm sorry about the heart and the nervous system, but we're going to talk about the joints, the muscles, and the bones, which really allow you to function day to day. So I have no disclosures. And so today we're going to describe sarcoidosis of the joints, the muscles, and the bone. We're going to try to differentiate joint and muscle conditions in sarcoidosis from some other more common joint and muscle conditions. And then we'll discuss the workup and treatment of these disorders in sarcoidosis specifically. So let's review some basic musculoskeletal anatomy. So you can see here, this is a picture of the knee. You have the muscle, which are the tissues that actually coordinate activity. On the edge of the muscle are the fibrous tendons, and the tendons connect the muscle to the bone. And then the bone is the building block of the skeleton, and then the ligaments connect bones to other bones. Looking at a joint specifically, I want to highlight a few structures. You have the articular cartilage, which is the lining of bones between joints and helps lubricate the surface of the bones to allow for joint function. And you have the synovial cavity, which is the space between two bones that's filled with fluid that further lubricates the joint and is lined by a synovial membrane. It can get complicated though. So in a single shoulder joint, you have multiple muscles, tendons, bones, all acting in a coordinated fashion to promote movement. And any one of these structures can be inflamed through mechanical injury or through inflammation that's seen in sarcoidosis or a systemic inflammatory disease. So it can be difficult when someone has shoulder pain to tease apart what is coming from inflammation versus mechanical injury and where the structural issue is. So just to review, bones are the building block of the skeleton, joints connect to bones, the muscles coordinate activity, and the tendon connects the muscle to the bone. And so we've seen a picture like this many times today. Sarcoidosis can affect any organ system, as we're all aware. And in terms of the most common organ manifestation, that is the lungs in about 90% of patients. And musculoskeletal manifestations, the prevalence or how frequently they occur vary from 1% of patients to up to a fourth of patients. I do want to highlight a sarcoidosis specific syndrome that some of you may have experience with called Lofgren syndrome. This has the classic triad of enlarged lymph nodes in the chest, erythema nodosum, which is a specific type of sarcoidosis rash, and then arthritis that can migrate from multiple medium and large joints. And so Lofgren syndrome, we think of slightly different than systemic sarcoidosis because it tends to be self-limited, but can also have very significant musculoskeletal manifestations. In terms of sarcoidosis arthritis, we typically think that this affects 1 in 20 to 1 in 10 individuals with sarcoidosis. This estimate was also present in our own sarcoidosis center, where there were about 56 individuals out of the over 1,000 individuals that we followed who had this manifestation. In the large picture, we think of acute versus chronic subtypes of sarcoidosis arthritis. The acute form of sarcoidosis arthritis is most commonly seen in the setting of Lofgren syndrome, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And so in this form of arthritis, you will typically get ankle swelling that's very severe. And to a lesser extent, you can have swelling of the knees, the wrists, and the fingers. And this is often called a periarthritis because it's not swelling in the joint, that fluid-filled structure itself, but rather around the joint. And so this is not a subtle process. It will be very painful, it will be very red, and it will be very swollen. Although fluid and inflammation in the joint space itself is actually quite rare. And in most cases, this is a self-limited process for 2 to 3 months. But as I said before, a subset of patients can have a chronic Lofgren's arthritis. This is just a picture of characteristic ankle swelling. So as I said, not a very subtle process. And here is another picture of ankle swelling, and you can see some of the overlying skin rash, which is called erythema nodosum. Chronic sarcoidosis arthritis is a less common form of arthritis that you can see in sarcoidosis. It involves multiple joints, very commonly the hands, the wrists, the knees, and the ankles. And one thing to remember is that tendon involvement is very common in sarcoidosis arthritis. So remember, the tendon connects the muscle to the bone. And you can have 2 types of tendon involvement. You can have a tendinitis or a tenosynovitis, which is inflammation around the tendon itself. But then you can also have something called enthesitis, which is inflammation at the attachment, so the point where the tendon goes from the muscle to the bone. And in rare cases, you can actually have swelling of an entire digit. Sometimes this is called a sausage digit or dactylitis. And in even rarer cases, you can have an inflammatory disease of the spine as well. So this is a picture of dactylitis. As you can see, the middle finger is significantly more swollen than the other fingers, and that's primarily from the tendon inflammation around the tendon sheath, so the covering of the tendon. Speaking to enthesitis, so remember this is inflammation where the tendon hits the bone. There are several spots of tendon enthesitis that are particularly significant, and those are the ones indicated by this number. If you look at 7 in particular, that's your Achilles tendon, so it's where that tendon hits the heel bone, and that can be a very common site of sarcoidosis-related enthesitis. Now, some of you may have heard of the diagnosis of fibromyalgia or received a diagnosis of fibromyalgia. That's a slightly different concept. So instead of inflammation in the joint or the muscle itself, fibromyalgia is a centralized pain process where your pain thresholds are increased, and it can really have multifactorial etiologies. And it's something that we're really trying to understand in rheumatology and even beyond. But I do want you to notice that historically, fibromyalgia was diagnosed by using tender points to judge the severity of someone's pain sensitivity. And as you can see, the tender points that are used for fibromyalgia can actually overlap quite significantly with the tender points used to determine enthesitis. So it's very important to make sure that you're getting the right diagnosis and that whether something is inflammatory versus non-inflammatory is understood by you and your provider. So it's also important to remember that arthritis is common and it's not always from sarcoidosis. About a fourth of the United States population has been diagnosed with arthritis, and that frequency reaches more than 50% by the time you get to at least 65 years of age. And so I'm going to quickly talk about some of the more common forms of arthritis, just so that you're aware that if you're having joint pain and you have a diagnosis of sarcoidosis, it's very possible that it's not related to the sarcoidosis at all. So osteoarthritis, as some of you may have heard of, is a degenerative wear and tear arthritis. On the left side of this slide, you can see a knee joint where you have the cartilage lining the bone. You have a nice joint space and the meniscus, which lines the bottom bone of the knee. And on the right-hand side of the slide is what you can see in osteoarthritis. So over time, you can have cartilage loss, bony overgrowth, joint space narrowing, and local inflammation, not systemic inflammation, that creates joint destruction over time and loss of pain and loss of function and pain. You can also have something called inflammatory arthritis. So we think of osteoarthritis as a degenerative, non-inflammatory process because there's not a systemic inflammatory response. But sarcoidosis arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, arthritis seen in other rheumatic diseases such as lupus, also, can cause this inflammatory arthritis, primarily of the small joints of the hands, like the fingers or the toes, but sometimes the medium joints like the wrists or the elbows or the ankles. The last type of arthritis, or the second to last arthritis, is crystalline arthritis. So the most common form of this is gout, which some of you may have gotten this diagnosis of. The risk factors for gout are being of slightly older age, having heart or kidney disease, certain dietary risk factors as well. And what happens in gout is that you can have a certain crystal that forms in your joint from something called uric acid that builds up in the joints and causes localized inflammation. And then there's another entity that resembles gout called pseudogout, in which a calcium crystal that can occur from the wear and tear joints from osteoarthritis or certain hereditary diseases can similarly cause an inflammatory reaction in the joint. One thing that I don't want us to forget about is something called septic arthritis, which is related to an infectious arthritis. And that's because a lot of our patients are on immunosuppression. And so if you do have one swollen joint, usually inflammatory arthritis tends to affect at least a few joints or multiple joints. But if there's one swollen joint and it's a big joint, such as the hip or the knee, and you're on immunosuppression and there's swelling, definitely make sure that you let your provider know, because you may need fluid taken out of that joint to rule out an infection. So in terms of figuring out whether your joint pain is from sarcoidosis, I'm typically asking my patients a few different questions. I'm asking them which joints hurt. As I said, small and medium joints tend to indicate a more inflammatory type of joint pain, whereas larger joints are more often degenerative because they're more weight bearing. I ask my patients when they have the worst joint pain. Inflammatory pain tends to be worst in the morning, whereas degenerative pain hurts more as you use the joints throughout the day, so hurts more at the end of the day. The severity and the length of the pain helps me make my decision about whether things sound inflammatory or not. whether activity or other provoking triggers make the pain worse or better. And then I also will look at how active the sarcoidosis is outside of the joints, because someone who has active multisystemic disease is more likely to have active sarcoidosis arthritis than a patient, for example, who's been in remission from their multi-organ disease for many years. But even with all these questions, it is not always clear cut, and oftentimes you need further lab work or imaging to help you understand the diagnosis of joint pain a little better. So for blood work, I'm typically getting basic labs, a uric acid, which can help look for gout if there are other risk factors, inflammatory markers to assess systemic inflammation, which don't tend to be elevated in sarcoidosis itself, and then oftentimes a basic autoimmune workup for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and other related autoimmune diseases. If there is palpable swelling, we will do a joint fluid analysis by taking a needle in clinic and getting out some fluid and looking for crystals or infection or inflammatory cells. Imaging can also be a really important tool to work up arthritis and sarcoidosis. X-rays can show very characteristic bony lesions, as shown in the red arrows, or you can have large cystic lesions in the bones. Ultrasound is something that I've referred a lot of my patients to because it can show real-time inflammation changes and can also show early changes in the tendon, which can be helpful and really indicate sarcoidosis arthritis. MRI can also show very granular changes, and then PET-CT, not to evaluate the joints per se, but to assess for systemic disease activity. In terms of treatment of sarcoidosis arthritis, for the acute form, so that Lofgren's type, I generally will think about NSAIDs as long as it's safe from a standpoint of other medical comorbidities. Prednisone can be used, but it tends to respond quite well to NSAIDs. And for the chronic sarcoidosis arthritis, again, you can use NSAIDs and prednisone, but there are multiple steroid-sparing therapies, and we really make these decisions in coordination with our multidisciplinary team to pick the agent that will, fit best for the multiple organs involved. And so here's a list of some of the steroid-sparing agents we use. You've probably seen multiple of these names throughout the day. So we really can use a lot of the treatments used for pulmonary and other organ manifestations of sarcoidosis for the joints specifically. I'm going to talk briefly about sarcoidosis muscle involvement because this is a very poorly understood process. And some of this confusion may be because there seems to be a mismatch between how much asymptomatic muscle involvement there is in sarcoidosis versus how much the diagnosis is made. And so one study has shown that random muscle biopsies of patients with sarcoidosis actually had granulomatous inflammation in over 50% of patients, and yet the diagnosis of sarcoidosis myopathy is made in less than 3% of patients. So, there may be an element to where we are underdiagnosing this in clinic, but almost certainly there is a lot of asymptomatic or what we call subclinical disease. In terms of working up muscle disease, it's important to remember patterns of weakness. So there's proximal muscle weakness, which is weakness of the upper arms and the thighs and the neck closer to your chest and your trunk. And then there's distal muscle weakness, which is weakness of the forearms and the legs and the feet, which is farther away from the trunk. And the patterns of weakness can help us kind of determine what type of muscle disease you have. Another problem with sarcoidosis myopathy is that there's many different descriptions of disease, so we don't have the clear patterns like we do in sarcoidosis joint involvement. So there's a chronic form of sarcoidosis myopathy described that is supposed to present over months to years and can feature trouble swallowing and predominantly proximal muscle weakness. There's an acute form that is a shorter course, also with proximal weakness. There's a rare subtype described with nodules in the lower extremity muscles that usually does not feature weakness. And then there is an entity of muscle pain and elevated CK that we've been seeing in our clinic that is poorly described, as well as a combined nerve and muscle pattern also poorly described. It's also very important because sarcoidosis myopathy is so poorly understood and we think rare to think about more common causes of muscle weakness and muscle pain. So medications can certainly do this. Statins and steroids are kind of two big culprits that our patients see a lot. Viral infection can produce a transient muscle inflammation, thyroid disease, overexertion, electrolyte abnormalities. And then some of the more rarer causes include a genetic condition, diabetes, or an autoimmune muscle disease. Again, when I'm trying to decide, is it sarcoidosis myopathy, I'm looking at what muscles are weak, what muscles hurt, the time frame of symptoms, looking at the sarcoidosis activity outside of the muscles, really examining the medication list, and asking my patients if they've had any vigorous exertion before their muscle pain. And this one is also very not clear cut. And so for workup, a CK, which stands for creatine kinase, is a marker of muscle injury that can be produced in elements of muscle injury and muscle inflammation. Aldolase is another marker that's a little bit more specific to the lung. I get basic labs and thyroid testing, inflammatory markers, sometimes an autoimmune workup, and then rarely genetic testing if it seems like the features of someone's muscle disease have more of a genetic component. Imaging is also incredibly important for this workup. So the go-to study for us is something we call an MRI myositis, which is an MRI without contrast, typically of the proximal muscle, so the muscles closest to the trunk of the lower extremities. We will sometimes do something called electromyography, nerve conduction study, also known as EMG/NCS, to look for if issues are with the nerves, the muscles, the point where the nerves meet the muscle, or a little bit of everything. And then in some cases, when we're really not sure what the culprit is, we can do a muscle biopsy. And the picture below actually shows a granuloma with a yellow arrow in a patient of mine who did have sarcoidosis in her muscles. In terms of treatment, again, this one is a tough one because the response to treatment can be variable. We are typically using a combination of steroids and steroid-sparing therapies, again, with a lot of the familiar agents that we've talked about a lot today. I'm going to very briefly talk about osseous sarcoidosis, which is sarcoidosis of the bone, because it's actually a little bit more common than I think we've given it credit for as a field. The prevalence estimates range from about 2% to about 13%. But the most important takeaway to know about osseous sarcoidosis is that up to half of cases are actually discovered incidentally. And so what that means is that when you're getting a PET scan to monitor your heart disease or a CT scan to monitor your lung disease, your provider may notice that there are lesions in the spine being the most common location, and the pelvis is kind of the second most common location. And so it presents a bit of a dilemma when you find these lesions quite incidentally, because oftentimes they're asymptomatic. And the question is, do you treat the lesion itself or do you observe and treat the other more clinically active systemic disease? So in our center, we tend to do the latter, but it's definitely something that needs more research in the field. And this is just a characteristic MRI imaging of spinal lesions in osseous sarcoidosis. So these are the same image, but a different MRI way of capturing them. And on the left side, you can see little gray dots in the rectangle vertebral bodies. And those are the sarcoidosis lesions. And on the right side image, those lesions are in white. And oftentimes, because these lesions can mimic a cancer, they're often biopsied, which is helpful to rule out other causes of these bone lesions and can help confirm the diagnosis of sarcoidosis in the bones. So I won't go too much into talking about diet because we had our wonderful nutritional lecture a little while ago, but I do want to emphasize how important exercise is in terms of musculoskeletal sarcoidosis. For the muscles particularly, we can use anti-inflammation therapies to decrease inflammation and decrease swelling, but ultimately the muscle has to rebuild itself and rehabilitate. And the most important things for that are physical therapy and incremental and consistent exercise over time. And a similar idea goes for joint inflammation and sarcoidosis as well. So that's all I have today. We talked about sarcoidosis arthritis having acute and chronic types. We talked about how common arthritis is and that your joint pain does not necessarily have to be coming from your sarcoidosis. There's many effective treatments of sarcoidosis arthritis that overlap with the treatments we use for other organs. Bone involvement in sarcoidosis is frequently asymptomatic, and the story of sarcoidosis myopathy is still being told and requires far more research. That is all I have today. Thank you so much.
All right, so I am going to invite up two of our patient advisory board members. We have Chris Thames, who is the chair of our advisory board, and Robin Goebel, who is the chair of membership of our advisory board. So they're going to give closing remarks. If there is any questions after we close out here, please come to a member of staff, and I will be sticking around for a little bit to answer any questions that you guys may have. Okay.
I guess I'm first. I'm Robin. I am the membership director on the patient advisory board for the Johns Hopkins Sarcoidosis Center. I was diagnosed with neurosarcoidosis in the fall of 2020. And I just want to say, wow, we're done. It was an amazing day. As we bring things to a close, I want us to take a moment to just kind of reflect on what we've experienced. When many of us heard the word sarcoidosis, it was in a doctor's office. And it was a complicated, hard to pronounce word that was really unfamiliar to us for an unfamiliar condition. But today, when we say sarcoidosis, it means something entirely different. It means connection. It means community. And above all, it means strength. Today, we've had the privilege of hearing from some incredible medical experts sharing their medical expertise and their insights, and most importantly, connecting with people who truly understand what it means to live with this condition day in and day out. I have truly enjoyed every single person that I have met and talked to today. And if there's one primary takeaway from our time together, let it be this: you are not alone in this journey. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to everyone who made today possible, to our amazing speakers, Dr. Bonham, Dr. Obi, Dr. Pons. Please, I'm trying not to forget anybody because I forgot someone very important last year. Dr. Galotra, Dr. Stern, Dr. Matthias, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Sharp. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your dedicated research, and invaluable guidance for us today. I want to thank the Johns Hopkins Sarcoidosis Center and their staff, and I'm going to shout out to Kayla and Victoria and Terry. We could not do it without you. And our amazing event volunteers and Becca and Karina from Aaron Leonard Designs. We could not make the logistics and the organization and the technical stuff that happens without you guys. Thank you. And a super special shout out, where is he? To Larry Franklin. Larry is also a member of our patient advisory board, and he's our event lead, and he and his family work tirelessly to make this magic happen. And thank you to each of you, our patients, our care partners, and family members for bringing your presence and your open hearts and your powerful stories. So as you leave today, keep sharing your stories, keep advocating for your health, and keep using your voice. Together, when we say sarcoidosis, we break silence, we drive research, and we bring hope to everyone who's impacted by this disease. Thank you so much for your attention today and joining us. Have a safe journey home and stay connected.
Thanks, Robin. So one thing I wanted to say is events like this don't happen unless a lot of people care enough to make them happen. So with that, I want to thank all of y'all for being here because you all made this happen. We could all sit round robin and talk about sarcoidosis all day long, but we're not going to reach out to people out in the community that need to hear more about this. You learned about things like multidisciplinary teams today. Who walked away never have heard about multi-D meetings? Well, they have their multi-D meetings on Fridays here. And you heard how much they're impactful because they talk about the patients and patients they share together. You're going to go back to your clinics and ask, when are y'all starting your multi-D meetings? You also heard about emerging trends in treatments. We talked about nutrition. We talked about different things during the day. But more importantly, let's think about what's lying underneath all of that. You didn't necessarily come here to hear about everything that was presented. You wanted to come here because of two main questions. How do I live longer? How do I live better? Those are two big things you want to learn about today. And I'll tell you, I'm not just the chair of this board, and it's kind of like Hair Club for men. I'm also a client, if y'all remember that commercial from the 1980s. I'm not just the chair here, I'm a patient. I've got multi-system sarcoidosis that I've been battling with a long time. I remember when we got that first scan results, I think it was chest x-ray. Lots of keywords and tricky phrases, as we would say in the nuclear Navy, but a lot of medical jargon that didn't make a lot of sense. You all got those first images and you thought, do I need to go update my will? Do I need to go do some estate planning? Or is it time to go work on the bucket list? You all went through a range of emotions. But now you're seeing what brings us together as a group here. We want to find answers. And it only happens through community, a community of patients, just like every one of y'all here today. Now, this is our third time doing this. Many of y'all I recognize from the first event, the second event, and I recognize you again today. Many of y'all have made friends with people because you have attended these events. Now, the biggest thing for y'all is, how will you go back and say sarcoidosis tomorrow? How will you help spread the word about this event and help grow this event so we can reach more people and we can help more people? Maybe there'll be more multi-D meetings because of the outcome of this. Maybe there'll be more advances. But I want you all to think about how we advance this. And purposely today, I sat at the very top so I could watch all of you. I didn't see a lot of heads nodding today. I saw a lot of people paying a lot of attention today. You were grasping onto the words. And when was the last time you went to a conference and you were disappointed because they had to cut off the questions or cut off the speaker? This was one of the first and only conferences I ever attend where people get disappointed at that. There was no short, number of questions to be asked, and there was a plethora of answers to be given. And just a huge shout out, everybody that was here today, you all came and volunteered your time to be here. We appreciate you, and we appreciate that. We appreciate all of our volunteers and medical staff for volunteering their time to be here. And this event only happens through donations. And if we don't have donations, it makes it tougher for us to continue this event because it is growing larger and larger. So if you can, you take a picture of this and think about making a donation to us on our Aspire page. It'll help continue this event and make it bigger and better than ever. So remember, you're going to go back. How are you going to say sarcoidosis tomorrow? How are you going to spread the word? And we appreciate you all for that as we're growing this community together. Thank you all for being here today, and safe travels on your way home.